Hello, my beautiful blossoms, blooms, and buds. I'm Rosebud Reads, and welcome to another Holiday Fanfic Special. Today's Holiday Fanfic Special is the first part of Cover Me in Sunshine, the second part being tomorrow. But it's by DamieMontclair, who was very sweet when I messaged them asking if I could do this, and I think you'll really enjoy what they have written. This is a Modao Zushi fanfic. It actually also has some very beautiful art, so I'll show you with my phone. Each one by I think two of them are by the same artist. They look very similar. But the artist for the first work is Melipo Neon, which if I'm saying your name wrong, I'm so sorry. But they have beautiful use of color. But I'm trying to think. Modao Zushi belongs to Seven Seas and its author, and MXTX. So we are just playing in the playground. I am playing in not only MXTX's playground, but also DamieMontclair. So thank you. With that said, let's just go ahead and get into it. Okay. Cover Me in Sunshine by DamieMontclair. Summary. When Fox shifter Wei Wuxian came to Gusu to attend the Lan Sect lectures, he had been looking forward to a break from his rather tedious life as a second-rate disciple at Lotus Pier. What he finds instead is 3,000 Rules, a jade-like dragon shifter who is way too fun to tease, and an easy acceptance of his supposedly disastrous shift. In the quiet back hills of cloud recesses, in the company of one Lan Wangji, Wei Wuxian starts to learn to value himself. Notes. Hello everyone, it's me again. I've been quiet since the end of MXTX-tober, and this here is why. Some of you may be familiar with the works from my first MXTX-tober, and well, I kept saying I wanted to rewrite Safe in Your Embrace. I actually started pretty soon after MXTX-tober 2022, but I lost interest for a while because people were asking me for more, which I understand. It was only 1K, but it was also complete as it was for me at the time. But then somebody mentioned reading that fic when in need of a smile, and I thought to myself, this fic made me smile. I want to rewrite it properly for myself. The way I could not do during MXTX-tober. The MDZS Big Bang was the opportunity for that. Title and chapter titles: Cover Me in Sunshine by Pink. Now, without further ado, let me present to you my amazing team. The art we have the show-stopping Melipo Neon and Ruby. Then on to the beta, the amazing Mint Moon Rock. And finally, my cheerleading squad, the one and only Just. Thank you for putting up with my bullshit and helping me see this through to the end, even when I went way over my anticipated word count and got writer's block in the final stretch. Having said that, please enjoy the fic and the amazing art, everyone. So, chapter 1, I've been missing yesterday. So it has immediately a beautiful picture by Melipo Neon. Again, if I am saying that wrong, I really do apologize. Here we go. And let me make sure I'm actually... There we go. I love how smug Wei Wuxian looks right up here at the top, and how the size difference between Dragon, Lan Wangji, and Foxian. Just because usually Foxian's so big, it's cute to see him tiny. Okay. Here we go. Ying's parents had been a fox and a red-crowned crane, a majestic, if somewhat incongruous, pair. From the moment he could understand words, Ying knew he would be a fox, a well-guarded secret of his mother's, only to be spoken about in the safety of the woods. He'd loved playing with her tails after she chased him around the fire of their little camp. But one day, they hadn't come back from their hunt, leaving him all alone at the small inn in Yiling, and before he knew it, he was on the streets, and tails only meant one thing: dogs. And dogs meant running as fast as he could and clambering up whatever he could to get out of their reach of their sharp teeth. Fur no longer meant comfort and warmth. Claws on the ground no longer meant safety. When a man who claimed to be a friend of his parents offered to take him back to his sect, Ying had barely hesitated. The man had known all the right answers to his questions, so he'd gone along, hoping that he would find a home. Only to find out that being a fox shifter in a water-based clan wasn't exactly pleasant. Don't get him wrong, it was great for a while. He gained a brother and a sister, even though he wasn't allowed to call them such. He had food and clean robes, a warm bed, and a room he got to share with his new brother, Jiang Cheng. He was happy. But when Uncle Jiang had taken Wei Ying off the streets and back to Lotus Pier, he hadn't really made a secret of his excitement at the prospect of Wei Ying inheriting his father's shift, a beautiful red-crowned crane, perfectly suited to the environment of Lotus Pier. Perfectly suited to be his son's right-hand man. Wei Ying had always known he was never going to be anything other than a fox. It was one of the few things he remembered his parents telling him. Ying will always be my little fox, his mother had said, when he'd asked her what he would become. His father had laughed when Wei Ying had asked if he would grow wings and told him that he would grow plenty of tails instead. He remembered soft laughter when he had asked how he was supposed to fly without wings, full of righteous indignation at the injustice. But knowing was one thing. He hadn't really understood back then. As he started attending classes and learning about cultivation, he also learned about shifts, the unique ability of cultivators to turn into animals. He learned about parentage, how it played into a child's shift. Learned how most families in and around Lotus Pier were gifted with water shifts, from birds over reptiles and amphibians to fish. Learned that the child of a fox shifter was always going to be a fox, regardless of the other parent's shift. Some evolutionary quirk to ensure the survival of the notoriously rare shift, the teacher had said. Wei Ying learned that he would never shift like his father. Never shift like Uncle Jiang had wanted him to. He had known then that he would disappoint Uncle Jiang in a way that he would never be able to make up for, in a way he could do nothing to avoid, nothing to stop. He had not shifted yet, but he was already doomed. After that revelation, he'd prepared himself, gotten ready for all eventualities. For the disappointment and whatever being a fox shifter may entail, considering his already precarious position in the clan. Yu Furen had never hesitated to make her dislike known after all. When the day finally came, Wei Ying had grabbed hold of all his courage and gotten ready for the small private event. First, there would be the first shift, then there would be a ceremony granting him a sword and his courtesy name. And then there would be a large dinner to celebrate his 10th birthday. He had in no way been ready for the look on Uncle Jiang's face when he stood before the ancestral hall, as was tradition, and was finally allowed to shift for the first time in his life. He followed the teacher's instructions word for word, reaching for the small inkling of a growing core in his danshin and letting it expand, his spiritual energy flooding his meridians as his body changed. It felt natural, like putting on a different set of robes or putting his hair up. The warmth slowly subsided, and he blinked his eyes open. His sight was significantly closer to the floor, and he barely had time to see his legs, covered in black fur, before he looked up at his Uncle Jiang, the only one who had attended his first shift, Yu Furen forbidding anyone else from attending. He had known his shift wouldn't be greeted with a smile, but he hadn't been prepared for the way that Uncle Jiang had simply turned around and walked away without saying a single word to him. Wei Ying was left to shift back on his own, nausea twisting his stomach. There was no ceremony. His sword was deposited in his room without fanfare, and a slip of paper with his courtesy name was pinned under it. There was no birthday dinner. He told himself it was fine, that he'd known it would happen. But he was 10, and no matter how ready he thought he'd been, no matter how bad he thought it would hurt, it couldn't measure up to how much it actually did hurt. How much he wanted to burrow under his blankets and never come out again. But he couldn't. There was training in the morning, and he didn't want to find out what Yu Furen would do if he didn't show up. In the privacy of his rooms, he took comfort in his fox form, hopping in front of the mirror to get all the angles. His ears and tails were tipped in white, a stark contrast to his black fur, and there was a red mark on his chest and forehead. He looked so similar to what he could remember of his mother, he almost cried. That night, he found out foxes don't cry like humans do, which was just as well. Life went on, much the same as before, and yet so very different. Uncle Jiang didn't look at him anymore, and before long he was reprimanded for calling the sect leader so familiarly. He wasn't invited to dinner with the Jiangs anymore, instead having his meals with the other disciples or in his rooms. He wasn't allowed to spend time with his siblings anymore. Jiang Cheng may have been annoying sometimes, but he missed getting to play with him and share a room with him, and he missed Shiji's bedtime stories, even the ones about the origin of shifts that he really hadn't wanted to listen to anymore. But Jiang Cheng had begged for more and more frequently the closer their birthdays grew. Then, when the shift became apparent to those around him, the rumors started. Now, he wasn't just the maybe bastard son of sect leader Jiang. Now he was also a fox, and all the things people accused foxes of being. Unruly, scandalous, trouble in the purest form. The worst, however, was the loss of sect leader Jiang's protection from Yu Furen's anger. It didn't matter what happened or who had done it, or if Wei Wuxian had even been present. It was always his fault. Jiang Cheng had tried to help at first. He'd even tried to sneak him medical supplies, but Wei Wuxian had been punished harshly when they were caught, and Jiang Cheng had learned to stay away. Wei Wuxian learned to keep his head down and only shift when out of sight. No shift at all had been Yu Furen's rule, but it was a rule they both knew he was bound to break because no shifter can hold back their shift forever. Not getting caught was key. He trained with everyone, studied with everyone, and at night, under the blanket of darkness, he let himself be a fox, if only in secret and in the privacy of his own tiny room. By the time he was 15, he was no more than an average disciple, regardless of his martial prowess. And he hadn't shifted publicly in 4 years. After all, a water sect couldn't have a fox shifter in it, and it would be disastrous if it were to be known outside the sect. Yu Furen had snarled. When the time came for the disciples to attend the lectures in Gusu, Wei Wuxian was desperate for the promised, much-needed break. A break from Lotus Pier's everything. He couldn't wait to get away from Yu Furen, the suffocating rules, and the more painful by-the-day punishments. And the lands were dragons. Dragons were interesting, and there was so little written about them in Lotus Pier's library. Wei Wuxian couldn't wait to see one shift. Would they be big? They had to be, right? Or would they be small and cute? Wei Wuxian needed to know. The trip was uneventful, long and tedious, and involved spending hours on a boat while everyone else around him shifted and enjoyed the cool water. He was used to it, but that didn't make it sting any less. Foxes could swim too. Upon arrival in Kaiyi town, however, everything seemed to go wrong. They couldn't find an inn and had to travel up the mountain the very same day. Then they were turned away at the gate because they lost the invitation. Somehow his fault, even if he hadn't been in charge of it. After retrieving the invitation, returning to an empty camp, they had left, couldn't they have at least left a note? And finding the gate unguarded, and barely warded, what were those weak wards even supposed to keep out? Not him, that's for sure. He got caught sneaking in by the most beautiful man he had ever seen. No, really. You'd understand if you'd seen him. And breaking rules he didn't even know existed. 3,000 rules? Who lives like this? For which he, of course, ended up getting punished for on top of everything. And then he'd barely slept a few hours before one of his Shixians had dumped a bucket of water on his head before dragging him, sopping wet, to breakfast. Because apparently the day started at 5 in the morning here. Dragons were so not cool after all. Classes, it turned out, were not the much expected break he'd expected. Well, that wasn't right. They were a great break because they were so boring he could nap through them and still get all the answers right. But they were not the learning opportunity he'd been hoping for and the distraction he'd desperately wished for. The fact that he spent most of his time staring at the handsome cultivator from last night, the second young master of the Lan family, was neither here nor there. It was impossible for a fox to sit still for hours on board, and he knew before the end of the first day that he would not be making it through the daily lectures without daily punishment. He even had to apologize to the Nai heir, Nai Huaisong, for being hit by the book thrown at him. Thankfully, his punishment meant spending a lot of time in the library under the strict supervision of Lan Wangji. And once he was finished with his copying for the day, he was permitted to peruse the text there as he wished, as long as someone supervised. The Lan Library was a dream, full of texts on talismans, music, general cultivation techniques, and so much theory Wei Wuxian could probably spend a decade reading and dissecting it all. It was heaven. Unfortunately, Lan Wangji had his own tasks and duties, and library time was thus heavily restricted, leaving him standing outside the library as he watched him go, more days than not. Not being in the library meant going back to the dorms or the training grounds, which meant interacting with the other guest disciples, who enjoyed shifting in their free time, tussling in the training fields, and creating large warm piles in the dorms. Not shifting, it turned out, was really hard when everyone around you did it, and you weren't allowed to explain why you didn't. Back in Lotus Pier, everyone had known he wasn't allowed to and why. They haven't wanted him to shift anyway. So no one had bothered asking him to join their games. Never realized how much easier it was to pretend not to care when no one asked you in the first place. Here, everyone kept inviting him to their games or their giant piles of fur or scales, and every day it got harder and harder to resist, to say no, to make up excuses that he was busy. Nai Guanzi was especially persistent, clinging to Wei Wuxian in his soft red panda form. Jiang Chang was quick to remind him of the inappropriateness of letting a young master cling to his robes that way. He hadn't realized just how difficult it would be when they left Lotus Pier. He couldn't shift in his rooms because he shared it not only with one of his Shidis, but also with a disciple from the Lan Sect. He couldn't shift outside because there was always a risk that someone would see, no matter how well hidden he thought he was. Wei Wuxian had never gone longer than 2 weeks without shifting, and by the 1-month mark he could feel himself slowly unraveling at the seams. His instincts clawed at him, his senses were going haywire, but he kept himself human. Slapped on talisman after talisman to keep from shifting in his sleep under the knowing eyes of his fellow Jiang disciples. Each day was harder than the last, but he managed. He fell asleep during lessons, but still managed to get his work done, to get the answers right, and the promise of quiet time in the library meant he was more than happy to accept his punishment. Weeks passed quickly, and Wei Wuxian was struggling to hold on. It had only been 2 months. How was he supposed to stay human for a year? He had no idea. It almost came to a head on the training grounds when the strain of practicing sword forms paired with the snide commentary around him made him want to snarl and bite and tear. But he managed to hold back, sharp canines biting straight through his tongue in his effort, entirely uncaring for the pain it brought him. In the end, he snapped in the middle of class, the pent-up tension boiling over all at once, following yet another of Lan Chiron's rapid-fire rounds of questions aiming to make him fail. Not only did he get himself kicked out of class, but he also got another month of punishment for his behavior, and was sure to receive further punishment from some of his Shixians for bringing shame to the Jiang sect. Instead of heading for the library as he had been instructed, he took his restlessness, his anger, and his frustration to the back hills. The back hills were blessedly quiet and empty at this time of day, and Wei Wuxian let go. He couldn't take his instincts clawing at him anymore. The need to run again amongst the trees, to burrow into the earth, to find a nice warm spot to lay on. With a relieved sigh, he let himself shift, stretching out his body as his 4 tails swished happily behind him. This was the most settled he'd felt since his arrival. Unfortunately, not shifting for so long had some rather unpleasant side effects, as he'd found out when looking at the state of himself. His fur was a mess, all tangled from lack of care, and he quickly made his way in the direction of the stream he could hear in the distance. With teeth and tongue and tails, he set to work getting the worst of the mess sorted, uncaring of the way he tore out chunks of fur in the process, before hopping into the water to finish the job. It was incredibly refreshing, and he basked in the feeling of water flowing through his fur, carrying away dirt and further untangling some of the mess. If only he could have hands to brush himself with, Wei Wuxian mused. Perhaps there was a talisman he could make for this. It could even be useful for humans to clean and untangle hair. He carefully didn't think about the potential applications of this talisman for pets. He shuddered. Dogs are the worst. When the water started getting cold, he hopped out, shaking the water from his fur before laying down on a large sunrock, stretching himself out on the warm stone to dry before curling up and burrowing his nuzzle under one of his tails for a nap. Being able to shift outside was amazing. How did people not do this all the time? How had he not found a way to do this before? Surely there had to be a way for him to do this more often. With the warmth of the stone under him and the sun beaming down from above, Wei Wuxian found himself slowly lulled into a doze, tail swishing against the ground, unable to stay still in his happiness, but unwilling to run around now that he had gotten comfortable. He was so out of it from the feeling of freedom and relaxation, from the best sleep he'd had in weeks, months, days, years, that he entirely missed the sound of approaching footsteps or the quiet gasp from behind him. He stretched himself with a yawn and rolled over, only then realizing that someone was standing right there. Oh no. This was bad. It wasn't just anyone. It was Lan Zan, who was in charge of punishment, whom he'd been supposed to meet in the library, who would, most likely, assign him even more punishment now that he knew. Wei Wuxian blinked at the other boy, frozen in place. What was he supposed to do? Shift back? Was there even any point? He'd been caught. Couldn't he just enjoy whatever moments he had left in this form before he was grabbed by the scruff and dragged back to Lan Kairen for further punishment? Except neither of those things happened. While Wei Wuxian was still frozen, staring, Lan Wangji carefully unwound his forehead ribbon, placing it on the rock next to Wei Wuxian, and suddenly, Wei Wuxian was cradled in the coils of a very comfortable, very warm, very large dragon, and a snout the size of his whole body was nosing at him, blowing hot air against his still slightly damp fur. With even mischievous, even under the threat of punishment, Wei Wuxian licked at the nose, laughing at the grumpy sort of look on the dragon's face. He wasn't quite sure how he was able to tell. The dragon face certainly wasn't more expressive than Lan Zan's normal face, but something about it made it so easy to read him. Wei Wuxian finally allowed himself to relax when all Lan Zan did was blow more hot air at him. He was fairly sure that Lan Zan wasn't going to tell anyone about this. Cradled in a warm embrace, snout once more tucked into one of his tails while the other gently brushed against Lan Zan's side, back and forth and back and forth. He let himself doze the rest of the afternoon away. The feeling of safety, a glowing fire in his chest, warming him from the inside out. Barely even noticed when he started purring, only knowing that he had and that there was no reason to stop, to hold back, as the dragon curled around him, rumbled happily. On a ridge far above the stream stood two figures. Well, that was unexpected. It's a wonder he has not caused more chaos during his time here, all things considered. Lan Shichen remarked, glancing down at the large form of his brother and the smaller form of the five-tailed fox nestled comfortably in its embrace. I wonder, has he shifted at all since he got here? Next to him, his uncle's quiet seething at the impropriety of the scene stopped, frown shifting to concern instead. I have not seen him shift. If he has not shifted since the start of the lectures, then there are bigger concerns here than a little bit of misbehavior and rule breaking during class, especially if he has tried to hold it off for this long. Wei Wuxian was finally roused from his nap when the dinner bell rang across the cloud recesses, faint from the distance, but still clearly audible to the fox. From the way Lan Zan moved, dragons also had sharpened hearing. With a sigh, or as close to one as he could get in fox form, Wei Wuxian stretched, shaking the sleep from his limbs. He didn't want to shift back, but it was rather unavoidable with needing to attend dinner. He really wasn't looking forward to the lecture that would follow once he regained his ability for human speech. Wei Wuxian startled when Lan Zan let out a surprised sound, shooting the other a questioning look. You have 5 tails, was what Lan Zan answered once he'd shifted back. And then Wei Wuxian blinked at him as he retied his forehead ribbon. His instinctual response was a resounding, "No, I didn't," but a quick look behind him confirmed that he, indeed, seemed to have acquired a fifth tail. What the hell? He thought to himself. He'd never not noticed when he'd grown a new tail. In fact, growing a tail tended to range from mildly uncomfortable to just plain fucking painful. He quickly sat up and shifted into a partial shift, grabbing his tails with his blessedly human fingers. With opposable thumbs! Why couldn't foxes have thumbs? He counted them again just to make sure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What the hell? He asked again, utterly baffled by the existence of the fifth tail. He turned to Lanzan. When did that get there? Lanzan still just stared at him. Wei Ying didn't notice? Wei Wuxian shook his head. It appeared a little over 2 hours ago. Wei Wuxian didn't know what to say to that. He really hadn't noticed, blissed out as he had been by the warmth of Lanzan's dragon form and his much-needed nap. In the background, the family bell finally stopped ringing, and Wei Wuxian grabbed hold of the distraction with both hands. We should probably head back before we get in more trouble for missing dinner. It would be such a shame. Lanzan stared at him for a beat longer before finally nodding, allowing the deflection. Dinner is important. Wei Ying should eat more. Wei Wuxian sputtered at that, but followed along when Lanzan walked away. It was starting to get dark, after all, and now that the persistent itch under his skin was gone, he could finally process the hunger gnawing at him. What he wouldn't give to be allowed more than 3 bowls of rice tonight. Perhaps some meat? A fox could dream. Hang on, the stream is being tricky. Just a sec. Sorry about that. Let's go ahead and continue. To Wei Wuxian's utter bafflement, he wasn't scolded when he walked into the dining room late with Lanzan. In fact, Lanzan led him straight to his family's table, where he was greeted with a smile from Lan Chen and a surprising lack of frown from Lan Kairin. Like so many other things today, Wei Wuxian didn't understand. And so he just smiled as he sat down in front of his bowl of rice and his sad vegetables and tried not to be too obvious about how fast he wanted to scarf it all down. He was starving, and he could think about what this seating arrangement meant later. Talking during meals was forbidden anyway. Unfortunately, glaring was not, and he could feel Jiang Chang's glare burning a hole through his back. He was definitely going to be getting an earful later for making trouble in class and then disappearing for the whole afternoon instead of going to the library for his punishment. Just thinking about it made him want to shift back into a fox and run away. Perhaps he could find himself a nice burrow and live in the back hills of the cloud recesses forever. Wei Wuxian put down his empty bowl of rice, knowing that asking for more would probably be pointless, when Lanzan handed him another bowl. Wei Wuxian looked at it, looked up at Lanzan, and then back down at the bowl. From the other side, Lan Chen pushed a plate of something delicious-smelling at him, and it took Wei Wuxian an embarrassing amount of time to process the smell and cite as chicken. He stared at the bowl before turning to Lan Kairin. This had to be a test. After all, it was forbidden to eat more than 3 bowls, and killing was forbidden in the cloud recesses. Lan Kairin neatly put down his own empty bowl of rice and took his time finishing his tea before speaking, quietly enough to not be overheard by the many ears turned their way. The chicken was not killed on the grounds. Eating meat is not strictly prohibited. Every shifter's needs must be accommodated. We can be vegetarians. You cannot. I apologize for our oversight. Wei Wuxian burned with questions. When did Lan Zan even have time to tell them? Why were they being so nice about it? Why were they letting him eat with them and even providing food specifically made for him? Why wasn't he being punished for his behavior, for his outrageous suggestion during class? He bit them all back. Talking during meals was forbidden, and he really didn't want to find out if they'd take the chicken away if he talked now. Instead, he quickly pulled the plate over and went to town, scarfing down the chicken as quickly and neatly as he could between bites of rice. He knew he wasn't looking very dignified, but when it came to food, that has always been the last of his concerns. Well, not always, but most of his life. One stopped worrying too much about looking proper while eating approximately the third time one was going through people's trash for leftovers. Once he'd scraped the last of the rice out, he placed down his chopsticks. With a sheepish grin, he bowed his head. Thank you for the meal. I apologize for causing trouble today. Humph. Next time you feel like making trouble, at least wait until your classmates have left. Wei Wuxian gaped. Was that really all he was going to say about it? He'd been expecting a lecture at the very least. Definitely some more rule copying, and all he got was an offer to discuss such topics in a more private setting. Did he understand that right? It couldn't be right. He looked for any signs of anger, any remaining annoyance, and came up blank. Lan Kairin must not be happy about it, but he also didn't seem like he was lying about the offer. That was surprising, to say the least. This time, Wei Wuxian bowed properly in thanks, deciding that the whispers that would cause couldn't be worse than the ones his general presence at the Lan's table would. This one thanks Teacher Lan for his offer and will happily accept the opportunity to learn more. With a nod, he was dismissed. Hang on. Sorry. Sorry about that. Wei Wuxian enjoyed the warm feeling in his chest on his way back to the dormitories. He'd been given chicken and the permission to discuss his ideas, and he'd seen a dragon. Lan Zan had been magnificent and warm and so beautiful. By the time he made it back, much later than his fellow disciples, he'd managed to entirely forget about Jiang Cheng's glare and the whispers his appearance at dinner had caused. The moment he stepped foot in the courtyard, all sounds stopped as everyone turned their eyes on him. Ah, right. He ducked his head, wishing he could go back to this afternoon or even just a few seconds ago. Anything to not be the center of this kind of attention. This, however, was familiar. Unlike the dinner he had just had, this situation was one he'd been in many times at Lotus Pier. With his head held high, a smile curving his lips, he walked onwards through the courtyard to his shared room. Jiang Cheng wouldn't shout at him in public, not surrounded by as many other sects as they were. Wei Wuxian took his time strolling to his room. He had no reason to rush, after all, and he wanted to hold on to the happy feeling from earlier just a little bit longer. Jiang Cheng was already waiting for him, his roommates kicked out for the moment and a silencing talisman already up. He'd learned well from his mother. Wei Wuxian had to give him that. Couldn't let outsiders know there was a problem, after all. Wei Wuxian let the words flow past him a comfortable distance away from his own body. He apologized at the right places, lied where he needed, and shot a wide grin Jiang Cheng's way when he left, closing the door behind himself and finally leaving him in blessed silence. He went about his routine, still comfortably distant. The cold water on his face barely even registered, and the tingles in his hair were a faraway worry. As he laid down, stripped to his underrobes, all he could think about was how hard and cold the bed seemed compared to the stone he'd shared with Lan Zan only that afternoon. Had it truly been only a few hours? It seemed like so much more. As he closed his eyes and pulled the blanket up, he tried to picture it again. The bright sun, the warmth of Lan Zan against him, the way his breath had gently blown through his fur, the feeling of safety. With those in mind, he let himself slip into sleep. Ah, Ching, Ah Ying, it's time to go to bed, Shiji slightly scolded. Wei Ying pouted at her from where he had just been wrestling on the floor with Jiang Cheng. Shiji! If you are in your beds in the time it takes me to put away your clothes, I'll tell you a story, she smiled. Wei Ying and Jiang Cheng scrambled up from where they had been sprawled on the floor, each heading towards their beds as quickly as they could. Jiang Cheng landed on his bed with an oomph. First, I want to hear the story about the shifts. Wei Ying bit back the story request he'd been about to make. It was fine. He'd gotten to pick the story the last 2 times. It didn't matter that Jiang Cheng insisted on asking for the same story every time, or that it was the one story Wei Ying really did not want to listen to. He really didn't want to be listening to anything related to shifts, not with his first shift less than a week away. Shiji laughed softly from where she was folding the last of their robes. Ah, Chang, don't you want to listen to anything else? Jiang Cheng didn't even pretend to think about it, shaking his head decisively. No, I want to hear the shifter's story again. And what about you, Ah Ying? She asked, turning to him as if sensing his dread. Wei Ying smiled at her, big and toothy. I'd like to hear the shifter's story, too. All right, settle down then. She pulled one of the low stools into the middle of the room. Her soothing voice filled the room. Long ago, before cultivator sects and immortals, there lived a man on a lonely mountain. This man had suffered many hardships and had not only lost his parents to Yaos as a child, but later on he also lost his wife and children to resentful spirits while he was away for business. Burdened by sadness, he had secluded himself from the world and the pain it had brought him. Alone on his mountain, he meditated day and night, praying to the gods for a way to protect the common people from resentful beings. Unbeknownst to him, someone had indeed been listening, and one day he found himself filled with golden energy, surging through his body and forming a bright golden ball in his dantian, a core. He knew then that with his golden light he could protect those that were dear to him from the resentful beings hidden in the shadows of the world. Once more overtaken with grief, he turned away from the small hut on the mountain, and with a surge of energy he turned into a bird and flew away. Wei Ying pulled his blanket over his head. He really didn't want to listen to the story where the hero turned into a bird, free to soar the skies. Wei Ying would never be a bird, and for the first time in his life, he found himself resenting his mother for being who she was. He flew and flew until he couldn't anymore, landing at the edge of a river. Exhausted, he let the energy go, crumbling where he stood as soon as he had regained his legs. The man was woken up by the screams of a child. "Help me! Help me!" could be heard from the other side of the river. With a start, he sat up, taking in the scene playing out on the riverbank. A young girl was desperately trying to scramble away from a water ghoul. Her robes were torn, and a flower basket lay abandoned on the shore. His eyes widened as the water ghoul's fingers clamped down on the girl's ankle, tripping her up and sending her crashing into the dirt. With growing horror, he watched as the girl was dragged closer and closer to the water's edge. There was nothing he could do. He could not swim across without dooming himself, and he barely understood how he even turned into a bird in the first place. The power that had been bestowed upon him surged once more, even stronger this time, and majestic wings sprouted from his back, carrying him safely across the water. With a mighty swat of his wings, he took care of the ghoul, saving the young girl. The young girl, he found, was an orphan who had lost both her parents in a water ghoul-related boating accident. She had been out collecting flowers as an offering to their grave. Moved by her story and seeing himself in her, he prayed to the gods that their gift may be bestowed on her too, and save her the life of hardship he had lived. Before his eyes, the little girl's wounds healed as new power coursed through her. And that is how the first cultivator, the only phoenix to ever live, found his first disciple. Shiji ended the story with a smile. Across from him, on the other bed, Jiang Cheng had long since fallen asleep. Wei Ying himself found himself unable to, even long after Shiji had tucked them in and left. The next morning, Wei Wuxian woke up feeling more rested than he had in months, and far earlier than he had in years. No one else seemed to be awake yet, a startling contrast to his usual mornings where someone had to drag him out of bed to be on time after he spent half the night tossing and turning. Since he had so much time on his hands before he needed to get to breakfast, Wei Wuxian decided to take a small risk and head to the back hills after getting dressed. Perhaps he was getting a little bit full of himself, shifting 2 days in a row in an unfamiliar place, but it had felt so good to just unapologetically be himself. In an unfamiliar place, but it had felt so good to just unapologetically be himself for a little while, to not be judged for his nature, for something he couldn't change. He could be careful. No one would catch him this early. And so off to the back hills he went, shifting as soon as he felt he was a safe distance away from everyone. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do after that. He didn't really feel the need to run and hide, and there were no sun-warmed stones to lay on at this time of day. As he wandered aimlessly in search of something to do, he reached a cliff overlooking the whole of the cloud recesses. With the sun rising over the horizon, the view was absolutely stunning. The soft blue of the cloud recesses a startling contrast against the redness of the sky. Wei Wuxian was almost tempted to shift back so he could sit against the edge of the cliff, legs dangling into the void as he watched the sunrise. It had been a long time since he'd seen such a breathtaking sunrise, or any sunrise for that matter, seeing as he was more of a sunset person. He longed for a scroll and some paints. It was a shame that he would never be able to drag Nai Huaisong out of bed this early, even for painting. Soon the sun had risen above the horizon, bathing the cloud recesses in soft light, slowly warming the earth and stone. Around him, birds were singing, chattering away at each other as they rushed to and fro in search of food. A rumble in his stomach reminded him that he, too, was beholden to the constraints of the flesh, and he slowly started to make his way back down the mountain, shifting back as soon as the bell announcing the start of the day started ringing. He briefly pondered whether he should try to sneak back into his room or not, before deciding that it was probably in his best interests not to face Jiang Cheng this early in the morning after what had happened last night. Thus decided, he quickly turned towards the path leading to the dining hall. Try as he might, he couldn't hold back the laughter at Lan Zan's startled face when he walked into the room, bright and early, perfectly dressed, with only a few hairs out of place, and most notably not being dragged in by his fellow Jiang disciples. In fact, a quick look around the hall revealed that he was one of the first guest disciples to arrive. He was even ahead of a few Lan disciples, if the empty spots at the Lan table meant anything. "Lanzan, can I sit with you again?" he asked, still catching his breath from that unexpected bout of laughter and carefully ignoring the eyes on him. Lan Wangji set down his meal and looked at the empty seat next to his. "Weighing is early. I was watching the sunrise. Did you know there's a perfect cliff right above the cloud recesses to sit and watch?" Wei Wuxian kept babbling at Lan Wangji as he quickly grabbed his own meal of bland vegetables and rice, quickly starting in on them. He was starving. "You know," Lan Wangji encouraged. Never mind." Wei Wuxian cut himself off and grinned at Lan Wangji as Jiang Cheng entered the hall, followed by the Jiang disciples. He looked angry. Wei Wuxian quickly turned back to his meal, finishing as fast as he could, in the uncomfortable silence now laying heavily between him and Lan Wangji. Class that day was awkward, starting with Lan Kairin, making him switch seats with Nai Huaisang so he could sit next to Lan Wangji instead of with the Jiang contingent, and the way Jiang Cheng's glare was drilling holes into him in the back of the head. Oh, sorry, hang on. I think I got an eyelash in my eye. It's the one bad thing about wigs. Always poking you. I think I got it. Okay. Wei Wuxian was almost tempted to misbehave and get himself punished, if only so he could avoid Jiang Cheng for another day. But that would only give him more ammunition and more time to stew. Best to get it over with, I guess. As soon as possible, and then maybe he could sneak some shifting time. Maybe Lanzan would be willing to cover for him. After all, he hadn't seemed to mind his shift at all. Perhaps it was a dragon thing. Dragons were auspicious. Maybe that's why he didn't worry about the disaster-bringing fox shifter in his midst. Yeah, that had to be it. Being on his best behavior was easier said than done. Forcing himself to sit still for any length of time was almost impossible, even after spending so much time in his shift and sleeping better than he had for years. The lectures were not anywhere near interesting enough to distract him from the need to move. With an almost imperceptible sigh, he shifted his legs, bracing himself for a reprimand that never came. He was sitting in the front row and obviously slouching, and Lan Kairin didn't even look at him? What? Wei Wuxian felt off kilter. The rules had changed, and he didn't know where the lines were anymore. His mind flashed back to Lotus Pier after his first shift, and how suddenly any small offense that had never been one before had suddenly been punished. Jiang Cheng hadn't glared at him like that back then. He'd still been worried and had often brought him bandages after dark. Right up until he was punished for helping Wei Wuxian, and Wei Wuxian had been moved to the furthest corner of the disciple quarters, as far away from the family quarters as one could get. He didn't even have a roommate like all the other disciples. No one wanted to live with the fox shifter of all people, but he also couldn't be kicked out of the sect without the other sects asking questions. And so he had stayed. He'd learned the rules that seemed to only apply to him, had learned the punishments for breaking them, and had learned to keep his head down and never complain, lest his punishment be doubled or other disciples be dragged into it. They already hated him enough without him getting them punished, he knew. This felt too close to that. The Lans had a wall of rules, and Wei Wuxian had just broken one, in full knowledge of the reprimand he was setting himself up for. Why was Lan Kairin just ignoring it? He didn't understand. There was an itch under his skin and an uneasiness as he waited for the other shoe to drop. And waited. And waited. By the time class was over, Wei Wuxian was an anxious mess, and his sleeves were all wrinkled from where his fingers had spent the better half of the day gripping and twisting them nervously. The second Lan Kairin turned to leave, Wei Wuxian bolted, entirely missing the worried glances from Lan Wangji and Nai Huaisang, or the way his friends Were they friends? Would they still be friends if he knew? Stomped over to Jiang Chang and hit him over the head with his fan. Lan Wangji silently gathered his things, straightened out Wei Wuxian's desk, and followed after him. Wei Ying, it turns out, was not as easy to find as expected. Not only was he hard to track, there was no clear path to follow like there had been yesterday. Lan Wangji could guess why. Yesterday, Wei Ying had left in frustration and anger. Today he hadn't so much left as he'd fled. Instinct told him that Wei Ying was almost certainly hiding, and that there was no point trying to seek him out. Lan Wangji, for all his enhanced senses, could never match up to a fox shifter trying to hide. Instead, Lan Wangji did the only thing he could do. He took a trip down to the kitchens and had them pack up lunch. Wei Ying would come out when he was ready. At least, Lan Wangji hoped so. Unsure where to go and wait, he let his feet carry him to the riverbank they had lounged at yesterday. It wasn't as sunny or as warm today, but that was fine with him. He settled down on the rock, the rather large box containing their lunch at his side, and pulled out his guqin. He was almost certainly going to be missing his afternoon practice. He let his fingers glide over the strings and into the familiar warm-ups. His mother had been the one to teach him those, and hearing them, playing them, was as much of a comfort as it was a necessary routine. He let himself get lost in the repetitive exercises, taking comfort in the music, filling the clearing around him. Lan Wangji didn't even notice when he'd shifted from the familiar exercises to something else, a new melody, filling the clearing around him. Nor did he notice the way the sun continued its journey across the sky, late afternoon sunlight streaming through the trees and reflecting off the water in front of him. He did, however, notice when someone sat down at the edge of the clearing. Lan Wangji didn't understand why Wei Ying was so hesitant to come closer, but he wouldn't press. He let his fingers glide to a stop on the strings and turned only as far as needed to lift the top off the box of food, the smell of chicken filling his nose. If he could smell it, he was sure Wei Ying could too. Wary of scaring him off, Lan Wangji turned back to his guqin, idly running his fingers over the strings, plucking random bits of pieces of music before settling on a Gusu lullaby, familiar and soothing. Briefly, he let himself wonder where Wei Ying had gone for a full afternoon. Wherever it was, he hoped the other had managed to settle. The tenseness he'd held throughout class had reeked of fear and anxiety, even if his scent had betrayed nothing. Lan Wangji couldn't figure out just what had caused Wei Ying's reaction. Was it being made to sit next to him, or maybe it had been Jiang Wanyan's glare? Wei Ying had clamped up the moment the Jiang Sectaire had walked in at breakfast. Lan Wangji could not think of any other reason for the reaction. It didn't make sense. Wei Ying was clearly comfortable around him, at least to some degree. Sitting next to each other shouldn't have caused this reaction. Similarly, his sect brother's glare shouldn't have caused such fear in Wei Ying. He hadn't done anything wrong, at least not to Lan Wangji's knowledge. A faint thread of worry warmed its way into his heart. One shouldn't be afraid of their sect siblings. But Wei Ying was clearly apprehensive at the very least. He hadn't shifted once in his time here until yesterday. Now Jiang Wanyan was angry at him. Were those two things related? How was Wei Ying treated in the Jiang sect? With his skill, he should be a ranked disciple, maybe even head disciple. But Lan Wangji had never heard of him before his chaotic arrival at the cloud recesses. With his skills, how could Lan Wangji not have heard about him? Before he could ponder the matter any further, Wei Ying dropped down in front of him, legs crossed, eyes on the box of food at his side. Lan Wangji dismissed Wangji and put the box between them. Wei Wuxian looked down at the food, the source of the tantalizing smell of chicken. Lan Zan, are you breaking the rules? He exclaimed, ignoring the gnawing hunger in his stomach. He was so hungry, and the food smelled so good. But he had been through worse hunger, and he wouldn't cave. The Lans had clear rules. Last night was an exception. He wouldn't. His stomach growled loudly, and he felt himself go red in embarrassment. Before he could wave it away, Lan Zan was already shifting the top part of the box towards him. Wei Ying missed lunch, he said, as if that warranted, what, a belated lunch? With meat? It was his own fault he missed lunch, and now Lan Zan was breaking the rules by giving him chicken? The anxiety he'd barely managed to shake returned full force. His hands twisted in the fabric of his sleeves. He couldn't accept the food, no matter how hungry he was. But it did smell good, and didn't the rules say something about lying and tricking? Surely Lan Zan wouldn't try to trick him into breaking the rules, right? Hesitantly, he reached out for the box, pulling it closer. He peered into it. There was chicken, but also some vegetables and a decent serving of rice. It looked entirely too bland. It looked absolutely delicious. He watched in silence as Lan Zan started eating his own portion of vegetables and rice. He should be eating too. If Lan Zan was eating, then it must be allowed. Why wasn't he eating? Why had Lan Zan brought him food? Why wasn't Lan Zan punishing him? Wei Wuxian didn't understand. He hated not understanding. His head was filled with an endless stream of why? 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 He blurted out, his eyes widening when he realized what he'd just asked. Never mind, forget it. He fumbled with his chopsticks and shoved a piece of chicken into his mouth in a desperate attempt to cover for his mistake. No talking while eating, right? The chicken was still hot, and he almost burned his tongue trying to swallow it down. Lan Wangji set down his chopsticks and closed the lid on his box. Because Wei Ying deserves food, just like anyone else. Uncle told you. Needing food that is suited to your biology is no crime. Most shifters in the cloud recesses do not require meat. Those who do take care of their needs either through hunting outside the borders or taking trips down to Kaiyi. Restrictions on food and behaviors only apply to the extent that one's nature allows. When out on assignment, plenty of our clan members enjoy a variety of food, he frowned. Or drinks, for that matter. Wei Wuxian blinked. That wasn't quite the answer he'd been looking for, but... So it was never about drinking the alcohol? It was about doing so within the cloud recesses? Lan Wangji nodded. If Wei Ying had been drinking outside, he would not have been punished. Oh. So if I took a trip to Kaiyi, I could eat and drink what I want without getting in trouble? What about curfew? Curfew would still apply. Wei Ying would have to stay outside if he returned too late. You said that restrictions on behaviors only applied to the extent that one's nature allows. Wei Wuxian scratched the back of his head, unsure how to ask his next question. But Lan Zan had explained everything without judgment so far. Why wasn't I punished in class? Is that why? Why? That stupid word that always got him in trouble. Suddenly, Lan Wangji understood. The fidgeting, the nervousness, the fear. Since he'd arrived here, Wei Ying had been made aware of the rules at every turn. He'd been reprimanded for slouching and fidgeting, for not paying attention. Of course he'd be out of his depth when the rules changed. It had never really occurred to Lan Wangji that Wei Ying might not be as unaware of the rules as he'd made himself out to be. Something about that bothered him, though. Why would a sudden change in the rules and a lack of punishment bother Wei Ying to the point of panic? Everything he knew about Wei Ying so far indicated that he should have been happy to dodge punishment. So why? Wei Ying shifted across from him, and Lan Wangji realized he'd been silent too long. There are certain natural behaviors that cannot be suppressed. Our rules accommodate those to an extent. He looked at Wei Ying. We have shift-specific rule books. I can ask Uncle to give you one. Wei Wuxian perked up. You do? He shook his head. Of course you do. I'd appreciate the opportunity. Wei Wuxian started, before remembering that he was sharing his dorm and couldn't just bring in a book about rules for fox shifters. To look through one with Lan Xiansheng. There. If he was looking through one with Lan Kairin, then he wouldn't have to take it back to his dorms. Satisfied with his response, he quickly stuffed the last of the chicken into his mouth. I will ask Uncle then. In the distance, a bell rang. If Wei Ying is feeling up to it, we could go right now. Uncle will be free after dinner. Wei Wuxian looked up at the sky. It's that late already? Wei Ying was gone most of the afternoon. I should get back before I'm in even more trouble with Jiang Cheng. He stood up, neatly stacking up the boxes for Lan Zan. Maybe I can look at the rules tomorrow, if Lan Xiansheng has time. Lan Wangji wrapped the boxes. If Uncle does not have time, I can go over them with Wei Ying. Wei Wuxian smiled widely, feeling the blood rushing to his cheeks. Lan Zan, you're too good to me. That night, as Wei Wuxian laid in bed, all he could think about was Lan Zan's voice as he calmly answered his whys and the warm feeling of safety. If he'd had any doubts about Lan Zan's trustworthiness, they had been entirely crushed by evidence to the contrary. He could trust Lan Zan. And even if he couldn't, he could at least trust that Lan Zan would follow the rules. And tomorrow he'd get to look at the rulebook for foxes. The world felt a lot more stable at the knowledge that the rules hadn't changed arbitrarily after all. He'd just have to be careful about how the other guest disciples saw his behavior. It wouldn't do for someone to figure out his shift based on the exceptions he was granted. Yes, he would keep following the usual rules as best he could and try to be subtle about the ways he was breaking them. He could be subtle. Really. Wei Wuxian was terrible at being subtle. Sneaky? Yes. Subtle? Not a day in his life. 2 days into trying his best to be subtle about the rules he was breaking. Sorry, I'm going to start that over. 2 days into trying his best to be subtle about the rules he was breaking, Nai Huaisang was dragging him off into the woods, demanding that he shift because Wei Xiang, don't you know foxes are great subjects for art? How many tails do you have? As annoyed as he was at having been found out, he was glad that it was Nai Huaisang at least. The young master of the Lan Sect was known as a lazy airhead, but Wei Wuxian knew better. Nai Huaisang was perfectly capable if he so wanted. He simply didn't care unless it was about art. It also meant that he knew to keep his mouth shut about it, and that he most likely wouldn't care about the whole unlucky business as long as Wei Wuxian indulged him. Knowing when he'd been cornered and unwilling to fight, one of the few people who hadn't written him off as a lost cause yet, Wei Wuxian had shifted and proceeded to take a nap in the sun while Nai Huaisang went on and on about the color of his fur, the texture, how best to depict it in painting, and eventually had shifted as well and proceeded to use him as a giant pillow for the rest of the afternoon. It was nice to have someone to cuddle with, and Nai Huaisang was fluffy and warm and oh so soft. With Nai Huaisang running interference, it became easier to sneak out. Wei Wuxian found himself enjoying his afternoons in his shifted form more often than not. It was freeing. Some weight he hadn't realized had been pressing on him had finally been lifted. Breathing was easier. Everything was easier. He threw a glance at Lan Zan from where he was chasing around butterflies. The dragon was curled up in a dignified manner, meditating. Turning away from the butterfly, he went up to Lan Zan. He poked his nose at his carefully coiled tail, ready to jump away at the slightest reaction. When nothing happened, he grew bolder. He nuzzled his face into Lan Zan's long mane of hair. That was nice. It was so soft. Wei Wuxian wondered how it would feel to comb through it. A strand tickled his nose, and he sneezed, startling himself along with a few birds around the clearing. That was embarrassing. Below himself, Lan Zan rumbled. Was he laughing? Offended, Wei Wuxian darted forward and licked a long stripe along Lan Zan's face before running off with a cackle. Behind him, he heard the soft whisper of scale against scale, and the chase was on. Everything was easier. Everything was harder. More and more, Wei Wuxian found himself confronted with the truth of his upbringing. Faced with the easy acceptance of Nai Huaisong and the Lans of Lan Zan, Wei Wuxian found himself struggling. Why did it seem like everyone who found out was fine with him, except for the Jiang sect? Lan Chen sat down and looked at the papers in front of his uncle. The one with the messy handwriting in particular drew his gaze. Is that Wei Wuxian's? He asked, curiously reaching for the paper. Lan Kairen let him, sipping his tea in hopes of alleviating his headache. It is. This is. Lan Chen trailed off, reading the rest of the essay in silence. This is genius. Shifu, something like this could revolutionize cultivation. It could, Lan Kairen nodded. Lan Chen's eyes drifted to the failing grade in the corner. Then why? Lan Kairen rubbed at the bridge of his nose. This was not the topic of the class. Lan Chen looked at the essay in his hands again. He should have known. Shifu did not teach talisman or array theory. That is unfortunate. Lan Kairen hummed in agreement. It truly was a shame. So much talent being wasted. But that was not the point of today's meeting. What have you learned, Shichen? Wei Wuxian has been spending a lot of time with Wangji. The other students seem to believe he is off gallivanting with Nai Huaisong most of the time. So he has been hiding what he is doing, Lan Kairen mused. That seems to be the case, Lan Chen paused, considering for a moment. Jiang Wanyin and the Jiang disciples as a whole have been growing restless. Lan Kairen stroked his beard as he considered his nephew's words. Wei Wuxian had been lying to his sect about what he was doing. He hadn't shifted at all for the first 2 months of his stay. The Jiang disciples were growing restless. Wei Wuxian had been sticking to either Nai Huaisong or Wangji every time he'd crossed paths with them. And that there had been that incident when Wei Wuxian had fled after class. Lan Kairen remembered well how Jiang Wanyin had spent the entire lecture glaring at the back of an increasingly fidgety Wei Wuxian. Something is very, very wrong here, he concluded. Has Wangji mentioned anything? Lan Chen shook his head. He hesitated. Shufu, I'm not sure if you are aware, but Wangji is planning to propose to Wei Wuxian. Lan Chen started carefully, aware that his uncle had not been happy about Wangji's infatuation with Wei Wuxian before. Wangji cannot propose yet, Lan Kairen declared. Shufu, Lan Chen protested, ready to defend his brother. Shichen, you're young. Lan Kairen sighed when his nephew's smile became strained. You are. Wangji cannot propose yet. It will not be accepted. He looked down at the essay in front of him. Wei Wuxian's messy calligraphy and the brilliant mind behind it. It was hidden. He shuffled the papers. That boy has been hurt. He needs to heal, Shichen, to be in a safe and stable position. He will not accept the proposal when he does not see his own worth. Lan Shichen ducked his head, eyes falling on the neat calligraphy and perfect score of Meng Yao now laying at the top of the pile. Shufu, I understand. Good, Len Chiron said, sipping at his tea. At least one of you does. Wei Wuxian was basking in the sun on a warm stone, letting himself be drawn by Nai Huaisong. It was nice, comfortable. In his fox form, he couldn't make stupid etiquette missteps as long as he stayed where he was. He hated to break the peace with his questions, but he was almost certain Nai Huaisong wouldn't mind. Maybe if he threw in another drawing session, too. Wei Wuxian half-shifted as soon as he noticed Nai Huaisong put down his brush and reaching for another sheaf of paper. He waited until Nai Huaisong was engrossed in his painting again before he opened his mouth. Nai Xiang, can I ask you a question? Of course, came the reply. Just don't move. Wei Wuxian bit his lip, doing his best to refrain from fidgeting. I was wondering, how come the shifts in the Lan Sect are so varied? Oh, that's easy to explain. We don't stick to specific shift types like the Jiang, Nai Huaisong answered distractedly. Specific shift types? Does that mean you take in all types of shifters? What about the Lan, then? They're all dragons, aren't they? Wei Xiang, don't you already know all this? Nai Huaisong chided. The Jiang are the only clans to restrict entry to specific sects. I suppose it hasn't been easy for you since you're not a water type at all, but we're different. Wei Wuxian waited for him to continue, daring to turn his head towards the other boy when no further explanation was forthcoming. Ah, right. Well, for the Nais, as long as you work hard, we don't care. Each shift has its own merits. Why would we hinder ourselves by turning away motivated cultivators or cultivators-to-be? As for the Lan, it isn't that they don't take in other shifts, but the dragon shift is dominant. So, it's simple genetics? Wei Wuxian asked. This was the first time he'd heard of another shift with dominant genetics. Yep, Nai Huaisong confirmed cheerfully. There is the odd non-dragon Lan, but most of the Lans without a dragon shift married in or joined the sect as outer disciples. Huh. Is that why you and Nai Zongzu have such different shifts? Genetics? Wei Wuxian regretted asking the moment the question left his mouth. He had heard rumors that the Nai brothers were on the outs about Nai Huaisong's shift, and it probably wasn't something Nai Huaisong wanted to talk about with someone like him. Nai Huaisong laughed. Wei Wuxian relaxed at the sound. Wei Xiang, don't you know better than to listen to rumors? Dagua and I have different shifts because we don't have the same mother. That's all. Nothing more to it. My mother was a non-cultivator, so nobody knew what my shift would end up being. People enjoy making up stories about it. Wei Wuxian pondered this in silence for a while. You know, Nai Huaisong started tentatively, startling him out of his thoughts. In our sect, someone of your talents would never have to hide his shift. Wei Wuxian felt his ears go back when the words registered, and he knew his face was doing something weird. Nai Wangji should be careful with what he implies, Wei Wuxian replied frostily before shifting back into a full fox, effectively putting an end to that conversation. He resolutely closed his eyes and buried his snout under his tails. He was not going to think about what Nai Huaisong had been hinting at. He was a Jiang, and he was being treated exactly the way a cursed thing like him ought to be. After what had happened the last time they spent time together, Wei Wuxian had been avoiding Nai Huaisong like the plague. That's how he'd found himself spending a lot of his afternoons when Lan Zan was busy wandering the back hills of the cloud recesses. Today, however, he'd left through the front door. He wanted to go down to Kai Yi. He may not have any money to spend, but being around non-cultivators would quiet the noise in his head. The moment he was out of sight of the gate, he veered off the path, deciding to walk through the woods instead of down the main staircase. It was quiet, only the rustle of leaves to keep him company. He was halfway to Kai when realization struck. Only the rustle of the wind in the trees? That was wrong. That was very wrong. He sharpened his hearing, spreading his senses. What kind of monster could get this close to the cloud recesses without raising any alarms? No matter. If the forest was quiet, Wei Wuxian was too close to it to leave it be, and returning to alarm the Lan disciples at the gate would be a waste of time. He'd simply have to take care of it. He kept listening, not moving from his spot. His head snapped to the side. There was something struggling to the east. Wei Wuxian took off at a dead sprint. He wasn't sure what the creature was or what had fallen into its clutches, but whatever it was losing. Badly. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to find when he reached the scene. Swabian already at the ready, but a ghost attacking a small spotted cat, leopard cat, not a native to the area, his brain informed him, was not it. The cat yowled at the ghost's claw as the ghost's claws tore at its sides. It bit at the ghost, but only succeeded at getting a mouthful of resentful energy. Wei Wuxian used the opportunity provided by the ghost's single-minded focus on the cat to leap at it from behind, slicing it through in one clean swing of his blade. In moments, the remaining resentful energy dispersed, leaving only him and the cat. He sheathed his blade, shoving it through his waistband to free his hands. He had a feeling he'd need both hands free to catch an injured, scared cat. Except the moment he tried to step closer, the cat's head snapped up, and then the cat launched itself at him, very clawed paws first. Wei Wuxian was about to dodge when the cat suddenly shifted, and he found himself with an armful of crying child instead. Wei Xian! The child sobbed into his chest, arms tight around his neck. Wei Wuxian's arms automatically came up to hold up the child. It took him a moment to identify who he was holding, but then, Li Shimei? He asked, stunned. What are you doing here? She was supposed to be at Lotus Pier getting ready for her 10th birthday shifting ceremony, not in the forest of cloud recesses getting attacked by a violent ghost. The girl didn't respond, too busy crying to notice anything. Wei Wuxian used the opportunity to take a closer look at her. Her hair was tangled and wild, her clothes torn and dirty. She wasn't carrying a pouch or bag of any kind. Had she come from Yunmeng all the way to Gusu like this? Why? What could possibly make her do that? Had Lotus Pier been attacked? But who would do that? Could she have gotten lost on a night hunt? Kids her age weren't supposed to go on those yet. She didn't even have a sword. Knowing he wouldn't be getting any answers while she was still bawling her eyes out, he tried to gently rock her, rubbing her back. It only made her cry harder. Whoops, he thought. He had no clue how to handle a lost, crying child. But she was his Shimei, and whatever had led to her being here could not have been easy on her. Now that he thought about it, wasn't her sister part of the Jiang delegation of students? Perhaps she would know something? At the very least, she might manage to comfort her little sister. He quickly turned on his heel, making his way back towards the path and up to the gates. Hopefully, they would let him in with an uninvited guest. Luck was not on Wei Wuxian's side. We cannot let her in without permission. I am sorry, Wei Gonzi, the disciple told him. Wei Wuxian wanted to scream. Didn't they see that this was an emergency? He forced himself to breathe deeply before replying, Please. She was injured by a violent ghost in the forest, and she is my Shimei. I'm not sure how she got here, but her sister is also a guest disciple. Can you at least ask Lan Xiansheng if they can make an exception? She really needs medical treatment, and taking her down to Kai would take too long. I wouldn't be able to afford a doctor, he refrained from adding. The sobs had slowed down as they talked, and he felt her go limp against him. He quickly pressed a finger to her neck, checking her meridians. Just passed out. He sent the disciple in charge a pleading look, and one of them finally took off. Wei Wuxian prayed that it was to request permission. They didn't have long to wait before the disciple came back, Lan Kairin and an unknown woman in tow. It only took them a moment to assess the situation, and before he knew it, he was being herded towards the medical pavilion while the woman, Mu Daifu, bombarded him with questions he couldn't answer. No, he didn't know what she was doing here. No, he didn't know how she had gotten here. No, he didn't know how injured she was because she shifted back before he could assess the damage. No, he didn't know how the ghost had gotten there. You mentioned she had a sister? She asked. Wei Wuxian nodded, relieved to finally have something he could tell her. He rattled off everything he did know about Li Shimei's sister and everything he knew about Li Shimei herself while he was at it. He was still talking when they arrived at the pavilion, and he was directed to put her down on a medical bed. He gently lowered her on the bed, stroking her hair when she was finally settled down. Her face was scrunched up in pain, even while unconscious, and laying on the clean bed like that was even more obvious that she had been on her own for a while. Her tears had carved literal paths through the dirt on her emaciated face. Without thinking, Wei Wuxian grabbed the corner of the long sleeves of his guest disciple robes and gently dabbed at the dirt on her face. It only served in making his robes dirty. The doctor shooed him away before he could go look for anything else to help clean his Shimei's face with. Sit with me, Lan Kairin told him, leading him towards a low table in the corner of the room. Someone has gone to fetch her sister. Is there anything else you can tell us? He asked. Wei Wuxian shook his head, gaze not leaving his Shimei, who was still laying limp on the bed. Because she'd shifted back while injured, the healer was going to have to wait until she was conscious and able to shift again. She just turned 10 recently. She was really excited for her ceremony. Even the fact that her sister and so many of us wouldn't be there couldn't change that. I don't know what happened. His mind briefly flashed back to his own ceremony. Could it be? He shook his head. No, of course not. A cat wasn't the same as a fox. Cats were cute and small and fluffy and useful. Foxes weren't cute and they weren't small and they were trouble. Only ever trouble. The door slammed open before he could go further down that particular rabbit hole. In the doorway stood Li Shiji, panting from clearly running all the way from the guest disciple quarters to the medical pavilion. Where's? She started before her eyes fell on the bed. Jing-er! With a choked noise, she rushed forward, falling to her knees next to the bed. Jing-er, she whispered, holding her little sister's limp hand. What happened? She asked, turning towards Wei Wuxian. He turned away from her tear-stained face as he replied. I don't know. I found her outside of Cloud Recesses. A malicious ghost was attacking her. But why would she be here? Li Mei asked, stroking Li Jing's hair, knowing none of them would be getting answers until her sister woke up. Thankfully, they didn't have to wait very long. They'd only just finished filling Li Jing into what happened and pouring each other tea when she stirred. Li Mei was by her side instantly. Jing-er! Li Jing groggily leaned into her touch. Gigi, it hurts. I know, Li Mei soothed. The healer is going to need you to shift so she can heal you, all right? Li Jing shook her head vigorously. No, I don't wanna. Why? Li Meng looked puzzled at that. What reason could there possibly be for her sister to refuse to shift? Li Jing didn't answer, only mumbling that she wouldn't do it. Eventually, the healer had enough, putting on her no-nonsense face and gently but firmly separating the sisters. If you don't shift, I will have to make you. We cannot treat you like this, and God knows what damage you've done to yourself shifting back while injured. Li Jing whined, reluctance visible in every part of her body. When it became clear she wouldn't shift of her own free will, the healer approached, holding some kind of medicine in her hands. Wei Wuxian could literally smell Li Jiang's fear from across the room, and before he knew it, he was standing between the healer and his Shimei. He knew that shifting while injured wasn't good. Gods, did he know? But his Shimei was terrified. Forcing her would help no one. He turned towards her, lifting his hands to show they were empty in an effort to reassure her of his intentions. Li Shimei, he soothed as he sat down on the edge of the bed. Mei, it's important that you shift back. Nothing bad is going to happen, I promise. He reached out to take her hand. It'll make you feel better, he added, trying to put on as much warmth into his words as possible. Just take a deep breath. He demonstrated the action, breathing loudly, and she followed. Now slowly let it out and let the shift wash over you. Putting his own words into action, he let his own shift wash over him, ignoring the discomfort at exposing himself like this. The Lans don't care, he reminded himself. He ignored Li Shiji's gasp, focusing entirely on the girl in front of him. He only made it halfway through his shift when he found himself with a yowling kitten in his arms. That had gone better than expected. Wei Wuxian ignored whatever Li Shiji was saying, focusing only on the precious bundle in his arms. He made sure his half-shift was stable before turning towards the doctor. He shifted his Shimei in his arms so that her injured side was visible to the rest of the room. The healer hurried to their side with some sort of poultice and bandages. Before he knew it, Li Shimei's wounds had been cleaned, treated, and bandaged. The healer passed her some spiritual energy, but there wasn't much else she could do. Now it was up to his little Shimei to do the work. She wouldn't be able to switch back for a while yet, so Wei Wuxian carefully laid her back down on the bed. He pulled on his powers to shift back, but something was itching at the back of his mind, some strange urge, and instead he let the shift wash over him fully, curling around the small kitten on the bed. It was better, but not quite it. He shook his head, trying to get rid of the itch. He didn't know what to do. He growled a little at himself in frustration. He didn't understand. What the hell was he supposed to do? It was on the tip of his tongue. The kit whined, and Wei Wuxian was gone. Instinct was all that remained. He gently nuzzled at her, licking along her fur, cleaning off the dirt of weeks in the wilds, and checking her over for ticks. Once he was satisfied, he curled even tighter around her, using one of his fluffy tails to cover her. Wei Wuxian slowly came back to himself, starting with the awareness that someone was purring. It took him far longer to realize that it was him. He was the one producing that sound, loud enough to overshadow Li Shimei's own vocalizations of happiness. It took him even longer to realize they weren't alone, and the background noise was, in fact, voices. Fuck. He shifted back all at once, ignoring the uncomfortable stretching feeling that came with shifting too fast. He'd entirely forgotten about everyone who'd been in the room with them. He really hoped Li Shiji wouldn't tell anyone about any of this. He forced himself to breathe. What was done was done. If Li Shiji ratted him out to Jiangcheng, there was nothing he could do. He gazed down at the cat still napping in his lap. At least it had been worth it. Bracing himself, he finally looked up towards the origin of the voices. In the corner, where he'd sat with Lan Kairen while waiting for Li Shiji, sat Lan Xianshang himself, Li Shiji, Mu Daifu, and another healer who was unfamiliar to Wei Wuxian but seemed to be comforting his crying Shiji. That was odd. Wei Wuxian couldn't remember a single time when he'd ever seen her cry. Not when Yu Furun put them through her most punishing training when they were younger. Not when she'd broken her leg on a night hunt. That'd have been a close one, though, even she admitted as much. Or when she'd finally properly bonded with her sword. He wasn't sure what there was to cry about, if he was being honest. Her Mei was safe. She was well on her way to being healed, and she'd acquired her shift. Cats could be vicious little things, and he was sure this shift would serve her well in the future. Ah, Wei Wuxian. You're awake, Lan Chiron said. Come sit with us. Unable to refuse, Wei Wuxian reluctantly got out of the bed and trudged over, careful not to jostle the precious bundle in his arms as he sat down. How are you feeling? Lan Chiron asked. Wei Wuxian bowed as best he could while holding a sleeping kitten. I apologize for my behavior earlier. It was unseemly. I hope I didn't cause too much trouble. With his head bent low, he didn't see the frown on Lan Chiron's face or the furrow in the healer's brow. There's nothing wrong with following your instincts, Mu Daifu said. How is she? The healer added with a nod towards the kitten sleeping in his lap. Better, I think, Wei Wuxian replied tentatively. She doesn't seem to be in a panic anymore. Mu Daifu hummed in approval. It looks like you are passing her some qi as well. That's good. Oh, I didn't notice. How had he not noticed? That was so embarrassing. Quiet sniffles interrupted his thoughts, and he turned toward Li Shiji. Her eyes were rimmed red, and she appeared to be going through handkerchiefs at an alarming rate. He leaned closer to Mu Daifu. Is she all right? He whispered, though not quite quiet enough, if the way Li Shiji started wailing again was any indication. Wei Wuxian, don't you of all people understand? She asked between sobs. She can't go back to the Jiang. Wei Wuxian tilted his head in confusion. Understand what? And why can't she go back? They won't punish her for a little running away. We've all done it before. You, Ishiji stammered. She is a cat, she said, like that explained anything. It explained absolutely nothing. Yes, he replied. Cats are great. They have great senses. She'll be amazing on night hunts when she grows up. I just know it. You... Li Shiji stammered again before cutting herself off, something like realization flashing across her face, followed by guilt? Sorrow? Wei Wuxian wasn't sure. Yumeng Jiang is no place for a cat, is what she finally settled on. But Yumeng doesn't have only water monsters. She'd be a great asset. He frowned as something occurred to him. Besides, I thought you loved your sister. Why would you send her away? It's because I love her that I wanted her to be safe, she shouted. Yunmeng Jiang isn't safe. Wei Wuxian flinched back, cradling the sleeping kitten closer to his chest and wrapping himself around her as best he could in his seated position. Enough, Lan Chiron cut in, reminding them that they weren't alone. Li Shiji paled at the reminder of their present company. I mean, that is, She stammered as it dawned on her what exactly she'd let slip. Enough, Lan Chiron repeated with a sigh. Li Mei, I think it is in your best interests to go back to your classes for now. Your sister will be safe here with our healers. You will report to Lan Wangji for discipline. I trust you know which rules you broke. Li Mei nodded, cowed, and left the room with one last longing look towards her sister. Wei Wuxian uncurled from his Shiji when his Shiji left the room. He'd never seen her lose her temper like this, and with what she'd said, she could be branded a traitor if anybody heard. He didn't understand why she was so insistent on Li Jing not going back. Was Yumen Jiang really that bad for a cat? He couldn't imagine how. There was food and clean water, a warm bed and baths, and as long as she didn't break any rules, she'd be perfectly fine. He brushed a hand along her soft fur. She wasn't Wei Wuxian after all. Li Shimei knew how to behave, and she wasn't a bad omen and unlucky and useless like Wei Wuxian. She wouldn't bring disaster to the sect. Wei Wuxian. Yes? Wei Wuxian came to attention. Right. If Li Shiji was punished, he probably would be too. She only shouted because he was too stupid to understand. He still didn't understand, but that was besides the point. Li Shiji had only broken the rules because of him. It was fine. Wei Gonzi, breathe, Mu Daifu told him, and Wei Wuxian sucked in a lungful of air. When had he stopped breathing? How stupid! Breathing was a necessary bodily function, and he couldn't even do that right. He didn't fight it when the other healer reached out and plucked Li Shimei from his arms. Whatever punishment he was about to receive, at least his Shimei would be safe with the healer. He pushed himself away from the table and bent over, forehead hitting the floor with a soft thunk. Maybe he could at least lighten the punishment? This one apologizes for his behavior again. This one will accept any punishment Lan Xiansheng sees fit. The room fell silent. The longer the silence stretched, the more Wei Wuxian felt the urge to fidget, but he held it back as best he could. He knew that he was allowed to fidget here. But bowing as he was, staring at the wooden floor below him, all he could hear was Euphorian's yelling and the buzz of Zidian. He squeezed his eyes shut as he bit on his tongue. The wait for the pain was the worst part. Sometimes Euphorian dragged it out, relishing in his fear as he waited. He really hoped today wasn't such a day. He just wanted to burrow into bed and hide from the world. He flinched away as something touched his shoulder, but no pain came. Instead, he was rather forcibly coaxed from his bent-over position and into sitting. He wasn't sure what was happening, but it couldn't be good. He flinched again as something was pressed to his lips. This was new. He didn't like it, but he didn't have much of a choice, so he unclenched his jaw and let the contents of the cup be tipped into his mouth. It was something herbal, the faint bitterness barely covered by the cloyingly sweetness of honey. What the fuck? Wei Wuxian woke up feeling warm and comfortable, with a heavy weight on his chest and hair in his mouth. He rolled over, hoping to dislodge whatever was currently choking him out and go back to sleep. The something squeaked in protest. How rude. He was comfortable and he wanted to sleep. Whatever pet had decided his bed was a good place to sleep was in for a rude awakening. He forced his eyes open, ready to glare it into submission. Came face to face with the wide eyes of a now very human Li Shimei. Wei Xiang! Wei Wuxian winced. He'd forgotten just how loud his little Shimei could get. Nothing like the little Lan disciples running all over cloud recesses. That shout had probably alerted half the Hall of Healing, too. He shushed her gently. Sorry, she apologized in a whisper, a sheepish look on her face. He looked her over quickly. She seemed much better than before. That was good. But it did raise one question. How long was I asleep? You were sleeping for a really long time, Li Jing answered. It was so boring, but the doctor said I can't wake you up. Did the doctor say anything else? He asked. Her face scrunched up as she thought. Nope, but Lan Xiansheng and Gigi said I'm allowed to stay here if I like it. You're not going back? Isn't Lotus Pier your home? What about your family? I'm not, she replied, sitting up and crossing her arms across her chest. Gigi says it's okay if I stay here instead. She'll come visit all the time. And she'll send me food. She said the food here sucks. But why? He was confused. Again. All the time, lately. She looked at him like he had two heads. She opened her mouth, then closed it again with a frown. She stayed like that for so long, Wei Wuxian was almost convinced he'd never receive an answer at all. Everyone deserves to be happy, right? She waited for him to nod before continuing. So if someone isn't happy because of something they can't change, they should be allowed to leave? He nodded again, waiting for her to continue. He wasn't exactly sure where she was going, stating obvious facts like this. So if I knew that my shift would make me very unhappy if I stayed in Lotus Pier, I should be allowed to leave, right? Wei Wuxian nodded once more, feeling like he was missing something obvious. And Cloud Recesses has a lot of feline shifters. I got to cuddle with some of them yesterday. It was really nice. So I want to stay here. I'll be happier here. She frowned again. Even if they have way too many rules. Who needs that many rules? Wei Wuxian was not following. Why would your shift make you unhappy in Lotus Pier? Couldn't help but ask. Because Yu Furin doesn't like it, she stated simply. For once, Wei Wuxian's mind was entirely blank. Li Jing leaned forward, her small hands pressing down on his chest in an oddly grounding manner. Her face looked far too serious for a 10-year-old. Wei Xiang, your eyes always looked sad at Lotus Pier. But not anymore. I don't ever want to feel as sad as you were at Lotus Pier. Wei Wuxian blinked back tears. How? Why? Had his feelings been this obvious to everyone? He hadn't even known he'd felt sad until he'd come to Cloud Recesses. Did everyone know? Did Lan Zan know? Is that why he'd been so kind? Before his thoughts could spiral any further, the door slid open. I see you're awake, Wei Gonzi. How do you feel? Mu Daifu asked as Li Jing scrambled off his bed and over to her own. The healer looked at him like he was an idiot for daring to try to lie to her. Wei Wuxian really wished he'd stayed asleep. Wei Wuxian eyed the intricate carving in the window panel as Lan Kairin droned on about the founding of the Lan Sect. It was a romantic story for sure, but Wei Wuxian was far more interested in the artistic depiction of what Lan An's shift had looked like. He wondered what his wife had been, as her shift was not shown in any of the many carvings in the long row of windows. Had she been a non-cultivator? Was her shift simply impractical to depict? Had it been like him? Somewhere at the back of the room, a commotion broke out. Wei Wuxian ignored it in favor of turning towards Lan Wangji. Was she a commoner? He asked. It was perhaps not the most tactful thing to say, but it certainly sounded less rude than straight up asking why her shift wasn't depicted, which was what Wei Wuxian actually wanted to know after all. Lan Wangji opened his mouth to respond, but loud shouting interrupted him. Jiang Wanyin, how dare you? How dare I? How dare you, Jin Zixuan? Wei Wuxian flinched at Jiang Wanyin's tone, but made himself follow Lan Wangji as they made his way towards the commotion. Through the crowd, Wei Wuxian caught a glimpse of Jin Zixuan, nose bleeding profusely and sword drawn. Across from him, he could just barely make out Jiang Wanyin's purple robes in the glare of Sandu. There was only one thing that would get Jiang Wanyin angry enough to pull his sword on Jin Zixuan of all people. An insult to my sister is an insult to my clan. Wei Wuxian hated being right. Before Jin Zixuan could reply, Lan Kairin burst through the crowd from the other side. What do you think you're doing? He thundered. Do not shout. Wei Wuxian had to suppress a bout of slightly hysterical laughter as the rule crossed his mind. They were so far past that. They were in so much trouble. Wei Wuxian paced along the covered walkway. Because Jiang Wanyin and Jiang Zixuan had drawn blades on each other, both Jiang Guangshen and Jiang Fengmian had been called to the cloud recesses to discuss the incident. To say he was nervous would be an understatement. At least it was Jiang Zhangzu that had come and not Yu Furin. He threw a glance in the direction of the pavilion they had all disappeared into as he kept pacing. They had been in there for an awfully long time. Rationally, he knew it was none of his business. He had not been involved in the incident at all, and he had the witnesses to back him up. But there was no helping the anxiety swirling through him, fueled by years of experience. Somehow he knew the blame would end up being laid on him. It always had. Well, he deserved it. Hadn't he? Before he could pursue that thought any further, loud voices and the slam of a door brought him back into the present, instantly silencing whatever was happening. Not that it made a difference when Wei Wuxian could see and hear Jiang Wanyin approaching. The furious look on Jiang Wanyin's face made Wei Wuxian want to run and hide. Surely that was loud, wasn't it? He looked just like Yu Furin, except less sparkly. The absence of Zidian was far less comforting than he thought it would be. He blinked, and Jiang Wanyin was there. When had he gotten there? His mouth was moving, but Wei Wuxian could hardly make out the words, drowned out by the ringing in his ears. Jiang Wanyin gestured with his hands. Distantly, Wei Wuxian was aware that he'd flinched, head down and shoulders raised up to protect himself from the blow. Yumen Jiang isn't safe! The blow didn't come, but the yelling got louder, snippets of it getting through to him through the fog that had wrapped around his mind. A disgrace! In our sect, someone of your talents never would have been able to... never would have had to hide a shift. Protect the clan's honor! Everybody deserves to be happy. Worthless! Wei Ying deserves food, just like anyone else. Cursed! You have 5 tails. Shouldn't have taken you in! Wei Ying. An eerie calm settled upon Wei Wuxian's mind. Wei Ying! Jiang Wanyin raised his hand again with intent. Everybody deserves to be happy. He caught the blow before it could strike him. His fingers didn't tremble as he reached down to his belt, untangling the clarity bell. With steady hands, he lifted it up, pressed it into Jiang Wanyin's hand. This one thanks the Jiang sect for all they have done for him since taking him in. He bowed deeply. I hereby leave the Yunmen Jiang sect. Notes. This was originally meant to be a one-shot, but it became so long it just made sense to split it here. The second chapter will come out on Wednesday, so keep your eyes peeled. In the meantime, feel free to move on down to the comments section to yell at me. Everyone who can guess what happens next gets a cookie. I'm going to continue to chapter 2, don't worry. But whew! Wow! I'm going to blow my nose too real quick. Sorry about all the side noises and that buffering issue. I'm trying to make this as nice and professional as possible, which is why there's no side comments. Excluding this one. So I apologize for the Discord phone call in the middle of this. Sorry, Dami. Oh my goodness. I'm saying your name wrong, which is even worse. DamieMontclair. I'm sorry that there's been some interruptions in the stream. I hope you're still enjoying it, though. Oh, I forgot to say at the beginning. I have the fic linked in the description. So make sure to visit and favorite and subscribe and leave some kudos because it's a really good fic and the author is amazing. So make sure you do that. They deserve all the love. Chapter 2. But what if there's a better place? Notes. Hello, everyone. 'Tis me, as scheduled. Some of you with good eyes may have spotted the new chapter count. Don't look at me. I don't know how this happened either. But seeing as this chapter is a whole 12K after being split, I think it was the right choice. Thank you to everyone who commented on the first chapter. It really helped me keep going when I felt like crying and throwing in the towel. I've had a bunch of real-life shit going on, and it's been tough working on this, especially when the word count keeps rising. Also, thank you just for putting up with my BS and cheering me on and sending me your reactions. I don't think I can put into words how much I appreciate it. Heart. Now, enough chatter from my side. Please enjoy this chapter. Wei Wuxian didn't know where he was. He blinked, and his surroundings came into focus. Oh, he was in the forest. Why was he in the forest? He couldn't remember. Sorry, hang on. I'm going to turn on my heating pad before we really get into it. Okay. What had he been doing before the forest? I hereby leave the Yunmen Jiang sect. Oh. The tightly wound ball of something in his chest started to unravel as the weight of his actions started to sink in. He'd left the sect. Why had he done that? What had he been thinking? Far more importantly, what was he going to do now? Acid chi churned through his meridians, burning, and his breath grew ragged, loud in the silent forest. He felt vulnerable, exposed. He had to hide. But he didn't have a burrow. He didn't have a sect or a home anymore. Where was he supposed to hide? He looked around frantically. Any place would do. A crevice between two rocks. A small hollow beneath the roots of a tree. He didn't think, simply let instinct guide him as he curled up on the damp soil. Hot blood filled his mouth. He buried his face in his knees as the pain grew. Was this how he was going to die? Wei Ying. He didn't dare open his eyes. Everything hurt. He knew, distantly, that hallucinations were a common sign of a major chi deviation. He didn't want to consider why he was hallucinating Lan Wangji of all people. Maybe because he cares, a tiny voice whispered at the back of his head. Wei Ying! He was burning up. Wei Ying! Cold chi suddenly started flooding his meridians, soothing the acrid burn of his own churning chi. Lan San. Wei Wuxian didn't remember passing out. He woke up slowly, cool chi flowing smoothly through his meridians, his core calm. The birds were singing. Somebody was humming. His head was resting in somebody's lap. Fuck. He sat up all at once, coming face to face with the startled Lan Wangji. Lan San! Wei Ying. What are you doing here? He looked around, eyes carefully avoiding the spot of scorched earth nearby. Where even is here? Wei Ying needed help. The furthest edge of the back hills, Lan Wangji answered. Oh. Wei Wuxian was freaking out. He knew how big the cloud recesses were. He had no idea how much time had passed if he'd made it to the furthest edge on foot. He needed more information. He hoped Lan Wangji would be willing to provide. What happened? Wei Ying left the Jiang sect. There were witnesses. The implications of that went unsaid, but Wei Wuxian could hear them loud and clear. There was absolutely no going back, for him or the Jiang sect. But that wasn't quite what he wanted to know. What happened with Jiang Cheng? Both Jiang Wanyin and Jin Zixuan are being sent home for breaking the rules and drawing steel on each other. From what I understand, the entire Jiang delegation will be leaving tonight. They were leaving. Without him. Of course, without him. He'd left. He'd abandoned them. He was just like his parents. Like his parents. He was a rogue cultivator now. Rogue cultivators didn't get to attend the lectures of Gusu Lan. What was he supposed to do now? Where was he supposed to go now? He could feel the panic beginning to build again. What about me? He asked, already knowing the answer. Why would they make an exception for him after all? Marry me. The words cut through the buzz of his thoughts like a knife through tofu. Who? Huh? Marry me. He hadn't misheard. He stared at Lan Wangji, waiting to wake up or something. There's no way Lan Wangji had actually asked that. Where had it even come from? Like, sure, they hung out and spent time together, but marriage? He didn't even belong to a sect anymore. How could he marry someone like Lan Wangji, the second heir to Gusu Lan? What could he possibly bring to the sect? He was very aware that he was worth very, very little, and a bringer of misfortune to boot. He stumbled to his feet, taking a careful couple of steps back. He swallowed, hoping his voice didn't tremble too much. Lenergonzi, what are you talking about? Surely you understand how unsuited this lowly one is. Wei Wuxian took another few steps back as Lan Wangji rose to his feet. He didn't think Lan Wangji was the type, but he'd seen and heard plenty about how some young masters reacted to being rejected. Wei Ying, marry me. Nope. That was Lan Wangji's serious tone, the one that usually came out before punishment. There's no way he was staying here. Wei Wuxian bolted. Wei Wuxian ran for a long time. He wasn't quite sure where he was running, but away from Lan Wangji seemed like a good idea. What had he been thinking at that moment? Wei Wuxian wondered. What could have possibly possessed the second Jade of Lan to ask to marry Wei Wuxian? Hold up. Could he have actually been possessed? No, that didn't make any sense. Someone with Lan Wangji's power wouldn't get possessed that easily. Had it been pity? Not for the first time, Wei Wuxian wished he could read Lan Wangji's face more easily. The sun was setting by the time Wei Wuxian finally stumbled to a stop. If he'd been lost before, then he had no idea what to call what he was now. In his panic, he hadn't even thought to keep an eye out for landmarks or the position of the sun in the sky. He had no idea where he'd been when he started running from Lan Wangji, and he had no idea where he was now. He sat down on a moss-covered stone. What did it matter anyway? It's not like he could go back. And if he were going to have to start roughing it out in the wild for the foreseeable future until he built enough of a reputation as a rogue cultivator, he might as well start now. First things first, he had to locate water. Food wasn't that important. He could practice in idia for a day or two, but water? Water was crucial, even for the loftiest of immortals. There was a reason Bao Shin Sanren was said to live on a mountain, not a desert. Since he was unfamiliar with the area, he'd have to do this part the hard way. He froze mid-step as a thought occurred to him. Why did he have to do things the hard way? He was alone, and he wasn't part of the Lan Sect anymore. There was nothing stopping him from doing this the way any other cultivator with the right shift would. He focused on his chi. It was still a little unstable, but the shift should work. He slowly let it come over himself, careful of any discomfort or pain. The last thing he needed was to deviate again. He could picture how Yufurin would gloat if he got himself killed by his own shift only hours after leaving the Jiang. The shift watch washed over him smoothly, his triumphant cackle cutting through the woods. Take that, Yufurin. He wasn't going to die today. Close to the ground and with his senses on high alert, he followed some tracks leading through the woods, listening carefully for the sound of water. It didn't take long until the distinct sound of birds bathing reached his ears. As he got closer, the soft rush of moving water made itself known. A stream, then. That was better than he had hoped. The birds startled and flew off as he broke through the underbrush. The stream was small but clear and smelled fresh. The thirst he hadn't noticed reared its head all at once, and before he knew it, he was standing belly deep in the water, lapping at it like he'd never seen water in weeks, before promptly throwing it all back up. Right. Go slow. That's what the healers always said. He lapped at the water again, more carefully this time, and stopped after a few mouthfuls. This time he did not throw up, though he should probably wait a little longer before drinking more. With that thought in mind, he decided to take a look around, stomach grumbling. He knew there were rabbits in the back hills, and any other day he might not have minded hunting some, but he was still on Lan lands, and he couldn't bring himself to break more rules today. Lucky for him, there were some berry bushes growing along the stream. He wasn't quite sure what type of berries they were, but he was a fox. Surely he'd be able to stomach them. Belly full and thirst quenched, he found himself a little hollow in the roots of a tree and closed his eyes, determined to go to sleep while it was still safe to do so. Lan Kairin sighed as he trekked through the back hills, a tracking talisman in hand. How his nephew had managed to mess up this badly, he'd never know. Honestly, he'd thought he'd taught the boy better than this. Still, he'd really have preferred to spend his evening in his office with his books rather than trying to track down a wayward fox in the growing darkness. Thankfully, the Jiang had not touched any of Wei Wuxian's possessions, and he'd been able to find a clearly well-loved wooden carving that the tracking talisman managed to latch onto. He'd apologized to Wei Wuxian for going through his things once he had found him. Rules cannot always be followed during emergencies, and this clearly qualified as if Wangji's shell-shocked face and blood-stained robes were to be believed. Eventually, the tracking talisman led him to a small brook before sputtering out with no Wei Wuxian in sight. The talisman had never failed him like this, and he wasn't aware of any method to counter it once it had been activated. With a sigh, he decided to take a short break. The water was clear, and night had fully set in. It would be pointless to keep searching for a black fox in the dark. He sat down on a mossy rock, robes already stained with his hike through the forest. The cleaning arrays on them would only do so much. It was quiet here, peaceful. The quiet song of the brook filled the night air, accompanied by the sound of nocturnal animals going about their business. Somewhere nearby, he could hear the labored breathing of an animal. Was it hurt? He looked around, standing up. It took Lan Sect a shamefully long time to spot the fox hidden between the roots, the black fur blending almost seamlessly into the foliage. If Lan Sect believed in fate, he might have called it such. Having found his errant charge, for that was what the boy was now, he sat back down. Now that he had found Wei Wuxian, he wasn't quite sure what to do. Ensure that he stayed, at least until the end of the lectures, yes. But how to go about it? Well, Wei Wuxian probably hadn't eaten anything today, considering the whole mess, so maybe food would be a good place to start. Thankfully, unlike his foolish nephew, he had taken the time to prepare. Out of his sleeves, he pulled out 3 Qiankun pouches. One came from the kitchen and had been filled with a warm meal, everything he'd need to make tea, as well as some dry rations just in case. The second contained some spare guest disciple robes and emergency medical supplies. The last one had been filled with Wei Wuxian's possessions, the ones that didn't belong to the Jiang sect. It was far too empty for a boy his age. He set the pouches aside for the moment in favor of starting a small campfire. As a cultivator, he technically didn't need the fire, but there was something comforting about it. Lan Sect didn't night hunt much anymore, but some of his best memories of his brother featured long nights around a campfire. Gathering wood was a matter of moments, and lighting the fire was made easy with the help of a talisman. The fire cast a warm glow over the small riverside clearing. In his little hollow, Wei Wuxian shifted but didn't wake. No matter. The food had preservation talismans on it, and Lan Sect was far more interested in the new blend of tea Lan Wangji had packed for him. Something Wei Wuxian would enjoy, he'd claimed. He gave the tea a quick sniff, frowning at the citrusy smell. He pulled the small travel tea set from the pouch and set some water to boil. The things he did for his nephews. Wei Wuxian woke up to the smell of wood smoke, cut through by something citrusy and slightly spicy? He'd barely had the time to register what might be pepper before the tickle at the back of his nose turned into a full-body sneeze. Well, now he was definitely awake. His nose felt uncomfortably stuffed, and as a fox, he had no way to blow it, so he quickly unfurled from where he was and shifted back. The need to sneeze left along with his fox form. How odd, he thought to himself as he rifled through his sleeves for a tissue. Where was that damn thing? He knew he had taken the one Li Shimei had gifted him back when she was learning embroidery, just where had he put it? Just as he was about to give up and use his sleeve, it's not like anyone would know, and he'd clean it in the stream right after, his fingers brushed the edge of the embroidered fabric. He pulled it out triumphantly, blowing his nose without much fanfare. As he stowed it away to be cleaned later, and why was his nose so stuffy in the first place, he finally took in his surroundings. A clearing with a stream on the side and a small campfire. A pot of tea and 2 cups sat on a rock, and standing there, halfway through pulling out a handkerchief, stood Lan Kairen. Fuck, Wei Wuxian thought, remembering the previous day's events all at once. Fuck, fuck, fuck! Lan Kairen interrupted him before he could work himself into another fit. Wei Wuxian, sit down, have some tea. Listen to what this elder has to say. I will let you leave afterward if you still wish to. Wei Wuxian sat down. It wasn't that he really wanted to listen to what he was sure would be a lengthy lecture, but he was simply too tired to fight it or run away, especially if Lan Kairen would just let him leave once he was done yelling. In the meantime, he might as well enjoy some of the tea. This student will listen to Xian Shang's wisdom, he said, bowing. Decision made, he reached for the teapot. Tea ceremony had been among the first things he had to learn when he joined Yunmeng Jiang. After, no one had cared, and Wei Wuxian had only had himself to serve tea for. He did not know what manner of tea Lan Kairen had brewed, but it smelled quite nice. Unlike most Gusu blends he'd become acquainted with the past few months. And it was most certainly brewed to perfection. All he needed to do was make sure he didn't mess up the rest of the steps. He carefully poured for Lan Kairen before pouring for himself. Wei Wuxian carefully set Lan Kairen's cup in front of him and waited for Lan Kairen's first sip with bated breath. He didn't want to admit it, but he really was quite thirsty. What he didn't expect was for Lan Kairen to take a sip, spit it back out, and then say Lan Shichen's name the same way one might say a curse. With a red face, Lan Kairen set the cup back down. I believe my nephew was quite right when he said you would enjoy this tea, he said, in as composed a manner as he could. Wei Wuxian dared to take a sip, instantly lighting up at the flavor. While the smell had hinted at a citrusy tea, it turned out that beneath the smell was a hearty dose of turmeric, some ginger, and just a hint of black pepper. Wei Wuxian would gladly take it upon himself to finish the pot, and if the way Lan Kairen was barely touching his tea was any indication, he certainly would have the opportunity to do so. If he was in for a lecture, at least he would enjoy some good tea. He'd have to remember to thank Lan Shichen for it later. Maybe. Somehow. Maybe a letter? The Lan Sect would like to formally invite rogue cultivator Wei Wuxian to attend this year's ongoing guest disciple lecture, Lan Kairen said formally. Wei Wuxian stared at him. Out of all the things Lan Kairen could have said, this was probably one of the last things he'd expected. But why would you... Surely there are other rogue cultivators more deserving of an opportunity like this. Wei Wuxian had run away. He'd left his sect. He wasn't even doing that well in the lectures. Until a few weeks ago, he kept getting kicked out for making trouble. He'd rejected the second jade of Lan Wangji, Lan Kairen's nephew. Why would they want him to stay? Because you are a brilliant young man, Lan Kairen replied, and you could do so much more if given the chance. The lectures aren't just about teaching young masters about morality and ethics. They are also about fostering talent. Talent you, Wei Wuxian, have in spades. Do not think I remain ignorant of your extensive use of the library. I have read your essays. And you've called them outrageous, Wei Wuxian cut in, earning himself a glare from Lan Kairen. Yes, your ideas are outrageous. They are also brilliant, and if executed safely, could massively lessen the death toll of civilians and cultivators alike. Would it not be righteous to support that? Resentment is dangerous. You said so yourself. The former Wen Zhangzu killed hundreds before the resentment killed him, and it took months for your sect's musical cultivation to cleanse Nightless City of the remaining resentment. Lan Kairen hummed, looking like he was contemplating Wei Wuxian's words. But what you propose, that flag of yours, it does not require the cultivator to channel resentment. Lan Kairen took a sip of his tea before looking straight at Wei Wuxian. Does it? Wei Wuxian was stunned. You actually read it? No, scratch that. Lan Kairen had not only read it, but understood and considered it? If Lan Kairen kept glaring at him like that, his face would probably freeze that way. Yes, I did actually read it. I do read every assignment, no matter the quality. Yours was brilliant, like I said. Then why did I fail? Stole over Lan Kairen's face. Maybe it wouldn't freeze into a glare after all. You failed because you handed me an essay about a highly complex experimental array when the topic of the essay was the morality of fulfilling a ghost's last wish. Ah. Well, it seemed fair, but it was at least partially related. You couldn't find a ghost's last wish if you couldn't find the ghost. That being said, Gusu Lan would be honored if you accepted our invitation. In light of your specific interests and talents, you would be welcome to attend some of our more specialized classes. Our array master has been greatly bemoaning the current generation's lack of interest in advanced array theory. Should your essay find its way into her hands, you would most certainly be granted access to her private library. Lan Kairen paused for a moment. She owns an extensive collection of texts about arrays and talismans, far larger than the general array theory section of the library pavilion. Wei Wuxian almost choked on his tea. A library dedicated only to arrays and talismans, with texts he hadn't previously had access to? Yes, he said without thinking. Please. He really, really hoped that Lan Kairen's offer had been genuine. Good, Lan Kairen said, pulling 2 booklets out of his sleeve. He placed one in front of Wei Wuxian. Now, as you are taking us up on a new invitation from the Lan Sect to you directly, there is the small matter of the learning agreement. Do not worry, we will go over it together. Wei Wuxian looked at the booklet, curiosity warring with dread. This essentially outlines the terms of your stay. It's nothing outrageous, really, and you do not need to agree to it right away, or at all, if you do not wish to. We will not rescind our invitation. You will be able to stay and study regardless. I simply assumed that you would prefer to know how these things usually go. The booklet was thin, only a few pages. Wei Wuxian wasn't sure what was in it, but knowing that he would still be able to stay if he refused to sign it was reassuring. He wasn't sure how he felt about signing anything right now. This is usually negotiated by the sect leader on behalf of the disciples and outlines what I'm going to start that over. This is usually negotiated by the sect leader on behalf of the disciples and outlines what you are coming here to learn, where you will be staying, whether you are open to participating in local night hunts. As you aren't subject to the requests of a sect leader anymore, anything in here can be changed at a later time. Should you find yourself more interested in something other than arrays, you would be free to add a new learning area to the agreement. It simply states that the agreed-upon starting point is this. It also helps to ensure that we have a teacher or the proper resources for you to learn something. Wei Wuxian leafed through the booklet, taking in the few headings and what was written below. The section Lan Kairen was talking about was right at the start. Half the page was blank, ready to be filled out with as many subjects as Wei Wuxian wanted, provided the Lan Sect had a teacher or other resources for him to study them. Lan Kairen leafed to the next page. As to the matter of where you will be staying, we will not force you to live in cloud recesses during your stay. So should you wish to stay in Kai Town instead, we will do our best to accommodate that. Due to the agreements we have with the sects, you will have to move out of your current room, but it should be no problem at all to find a suitable guest house for you. Guest disciples outside of sects are granted guest houses with full facilities. You will be able to cook your own meals. It is my understanding that our food has been a sticking point for you. Wei Wuxian nodded. A kitchen sounded amazing. He wasn't the best cook, but it would allow him to bring in meat from outside whenever he wanted. And chili oil. Besides, he couldn't afford to stay in Kai Town. And, well, he'd still have to adhere to curfew. Probably. He was almost certain there was a section of the rules about nocturnal shifters and curfew somewhere. He'd have easier access to the library if he stayed here. He tried very hard not to think about being closer to Lan Zan. He'd refused his proposal. There's no way you still want to spend time with Wei Wuxian after that. Lan Kairen kept going over the individual points, explaining them in great detail. Far greater than probably necessary, but Wei Wuxian appreciated it. When they reached the end, Wei Wuxian was almost ready to sign it. Almost. He hadn't been able to find a single catch or anything that would bind him here in any way. He was free to change his learning subject and his accommodation. He could change his mind about night hunts at any time, and even if he said yes, he was free to refuse night hunts on a case-by-case basis. He was free to come and go from cloud recesses as he wanted. He didn't even need to pay for anything since he'd been invited, and he'd be compensated for night hunts. It sounded perfect. Which is exactly why Wei Wuxian was not going to sign it. Not yet, at least. I'll think about it, he told Lan Kairen, almost expecting him to go back on what he'd said when he'd first pulled out the agreement. Of course. I never expected you to sign it right away, Lan Kairen replied, not a trace of impatience or discontent on his face. For now, let's head back and get you settled in one of the guest houses. We should be able to have something ready by tonight. Wei Wuxian gave one last glance to the book before pocketing it and gathering the rest of his things. He was smart, but he wasn't all that familiar with this kind of document or the language used within. Lucky for him, he knew one person who most certainly was. Wei Xiang! Why did you do this to me? Nai Huaisang dramatically flopped down into the grass. Don't you know I am here for the 3rd year in a row, Wei Xiang? Why would you ask me to do this? Wei Wuxian gave Nai Huaisang an unimpressed look. I haven't known you for long, Nai Xiang, but I'd have to be stupid not to know you're just here to get out of saber training. And any other kind of work a sectaire usually gets saddled with, he didn't say. He had been getting more comfortable around the night air, but not that much. The unspoken words hung heavily in the air between them regardless. Wei Xiang, you know me so well already, Nai Huaisang cheered. I suppose I can look in some boring paperwork for a friend, but you have to promise me to let me use your kitchen at least once. Wei Wuxian considered this briefly before handing over the book. Deal, but you have to share what you make. So, you will be moving to somewhere else. I knew it. Nai Huaisang snatched the book out of Wei Wuxian's hands, opening it straight to the first page. How is it? Of course you knew it, Wei Wuxian thought to himself as he sat down in the grass, looking up at the sky. Nothing happens without you knowing. I haven't seen it yet. Lan Xiansheng said that they'd have it ready by tonight. I bet they will, Nai Huaisang hummed, eyes focused on the document. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, only the occasional turning of a page cutting through it periodically. The sound of the book snapping shut startled Wei Wuxian. He turned towards a contemplative-looking Nai Huaisang. This is pretty good, This is pretty good, Wei Xiang. Wei Wuxian perked up at that. Yeah? Yeah, Nai Huaisang confirmed. Obviously, they're Lans. They wouldn't have been any weird clauses, but that aside, you're essentially being given free rein to study and do whatever you want, within the bounds of the rules. You can leave whenever you want, and there is no clause stating that your invitation will expire if you decide to go see the world for a year. And you're given your own home. They don't even ask for any rights to whatever you come up with using their resources, and you'll be given their protection as their guest. Nai Huaisang put the book down, turning to properly face Wei Wuxian. Wei Xiang, he said, the most serious Wei Wuxian had ever heard him. Everything in here is to your benefit, he paused. Everything. I don't trust it, Wei Wuxian admitted. There was no way it was real. You better, because this, Nai Huaisang waved the booklet around, this is very real. This says it's a learning agreement, and it is. Nai Huaisang leaned in close, pinning Wei Wuxian in place with his gaze. But it's also an offer, Wei Xiang. They're offering you a home for as long as you want it. No strings attached. You'd be stupid to deny it. That was too much. Far, far too much. No matter what Lan Kairen said. Something bubbled in his chest, and Wei Wuxian didn't care to identify it. He snatched the book back, shoved it in his sleeve, and promptly turned into a fox. Foxes don't have to think about too good to be true, learning agreements, or complicated emotions. They could curl up in the sun and bask and not think about anything at all. Nai Huaisang was still talking, but Wei Wuxian wasn't listening anymore. Somewhere inside, he'd known that Lan Kairen wasn't lying. But to have it confirmed like this, to know there was no trap, he didn't know what to do with that. A hand came down on his back, softly stroking his fur, and he allowed his eyes to close into a light doze. He'd have time to worry about things later. For now, he was in the sun and comfortable, and Nai Huaisang was probably going to shift any moment to join him. Sorry, hang on. Wei Wuxian followed quietly along as Lan Kairen led him to his new home after dinner. It was a different part of the cloud recesses, closer to the library and away from the classrooms. Individual houses surrounded by tall fences for privacy dotted the sides of the path. This was clearly meant for visiting scholars, not a 15-year-old rogue cultivator of no renown. It would make sense, though. If they really were trying to get him to stay and make a home here as a guest, it wasn't uncommon for sects to extend invitations for promising rogue cultivators to stay with them in hopes that they'd join the sect eventually. The house they stopped in front of wasn't small, but it wasn't large either. It looked cozy, with lanterns lighting up the small porch. Gravel crunched under his feet as they walked closer. The trees and the gate leading into the garden surrounded the house gave it an air of privacy that the shared rooms had been missing. It was far nicer than any place he'd stayed in for a long time. Wei Wuxian wanted to protest when Lan Kairen opened the door for him. He didn't deserve it, no matter how genius his ideas may seem to his teacher. Lan Kairen glared at him as if anticipating his protests. This is the standard accommodation granted to rogue cultivators and scholars. As a rogue cultivator, you more than meet the qualifications to stay in this house. I will let you get acquainted with your new house. While curfew does not apply to you, do remember not to disturb others should you stay up late or wander the grounds. You are still expected to attend class tomorrow morning. Have a good evening. With that, Lan Kairen turned and left. Wei Wuxian wasn't sure how long he stood in the doorway, staring blankly at the wall. Eventually, he managed to shake himself out of his daze, moving further into the room and closing the door behind him. He was tired, and as much as he wanted to explore the empty space the way Lan Kairen had suggested he do, all he really wished to do right now was go to sleep. Thankfully, the bed was easy to find, and he let himself fall straight into it after dumping his few belongings on a random shelf. Sleep, for once, came easily. Classes the next day were awkward. That felt like a massive understatement to Wei Wuxian, but he didn't think that there was even a word that could encompass just how awkward the whole thing was. It was hanging over the classroom like a thick blanket, pressing down on them. Everyone knew by now. No matter the rules about gossip, a whole chunk of the room was empty, and here Wei Wuxian was, sitting next to Lan Wangji in brand new guest disciple robes without any Jiang purple. Speaking about the other, was this really something they could just brush under the rug? Shouldn't they talk about it or something? Not that Wei Wuxian wanted to talk about it, but it felt wrong to just go back to normal like it never happened. You don't propose to someone out of the blue and then go back to acting like it never happened the day after. That's not how it works. That is to say, Class that day was extremely uncomfortable for everyone involved, and Wei Wuxian could not leave fast enough once Lan Kairin had finished the day's lesson. The further away he got from the lecture hall, the quieter it got, and he could finally feel himself relaxing. That had been one of the most unpleasant lessons he had ever had to attend, and he'd had to attend those lessons with the rest of the male Jiang disciples. Either way, the quiet was soothing, right up until he closed the door of the house behind him, and the silence went from soothing to oppressive in a matter of seconds. All his life, he'd been around people. Even in Lotus Pier, in his single room, he could still hear people around. Here, there was nothing but the rustling of the trees outside and the chirping of birds. Without conscious thought, he let himself shift partially, relaxing when his enhanced senses picked up the quiet sound of Lans walking the paths and the distant yelling of some of the guest disciples, followed by a stern reprimand and then quieter sounds. This was good. This was okay. He could hear people, and people couldn't see him. He breathed deeply, trying to loosen some of the tension in his body. With the quiet noise in the background, he decided it was about time he toured the house. He'd been too tired yesterday, but it'd be good to know the layout of the place he'd be staying in for the foreseeable future. The main room was split in 3. On the right side was a desk for work, surrounded by empty shelves, presumably for books and texts the scholar was using. In the middle of the room was a sort of receiving area, with a desk presumably to entertain guests with tea. On the left, behind a privacy screen, was the bed as well as the small chest of brand new guest robes he'd received. Past that was another screen hiding a door. Inside was a bathroom with a wooden tub, some towels, and a variety of cleaning products. He glanced at them, already deciding not to use any. He didn't have the money to pay for it, and he'd only made that mistake once while staying at an inn. Logically speaking, he knew that the Lans would not have put anything here they did not expect him to use, but he still remembered the punishment he'd received and could not bring himself to even consider using any of the products. He had a bar of soap in his bag and some hair oil he'd managed to wheedle out one of the ladies at the market. He'd be fine. Seeing that there was not much else besides small waste. Seeing that there was not much else, being a small wash basin and mirror, he moved back to the main room. He considered the room for a moment before moving outside, walking along the porch past a small well all around the house, and there, a small covered walkway led straight to a separate small building that could only be the kitchen. Wei Wuxian skipped over to the small building, throwing open the doors with enthusiasm. The inside was simple. The stove featured prominently, a small stack of firewood next to it. On the opposite side was a space to prepare food, and the wall opposite the door held a simple shelf, stacked with what Wei Wuxian assumed to be some basics. He lifted the lids off every jar, opened every bag and cupboard, and found rice, various pickled vegetables, salt, plates, and bowls, and a whole tea set, and not a single spice. How rude! He poked at what looked to be a jar of pickled radish. Didn't they know it tasted better with some chilies in it? As soon as he had money, he was buying himself chilies. That was non-negotiable. In the distance, the meal bell rang. Wei Wuxian glanced between the kitchen and the direction where the dining hall laid. He didn't know enough about cooking to make his own meal yet. He really needed to go do some research. On the other hand, if the atmosphere was the same as the classroom, then he was better off trying his luck with making his own food. But if he stayed here, he would have no chance to pull Lan Zhen aside to talk. With a mournful look at the kitchen, he closed the door, only just remembering to shift back to fully human before he stepped onto the main path. That was not good. He needed to be careful. Do not let anyone see you. Ever. Yu Furin's voice rang through his head, as cold as a Yiling night. He shuddered, glad for the privacy of his new home. Wei Wuxian hadn't even managed to step foot into the hall yet when a small bundle of white barreled straight into him. Wei Wuxian! He looked down to find Li Jing clinging tightly to his robes. Her eyes were red and her cheeks splotchy like she had been crying. You're okay, she said with a wobble in her voice. Lan Zan can wait, Wei Wuxian decided, taking a knee and smiling at his little Shimei. I am, he said, petting her head. He wasn't. Not really, but that wasn't what she needed to hear now. At 10, she was probably too old to be carried, but it didn't matter to Wei Wuxian. His core was strong enough, and she could clearly use the comfort. Let's eat together, all right? You can tell me all about your new classes. It did not occur to Wei Wuxian that Lan Wangji had not been at the dining hall that night until much later. Wei Wuxian rolled his sleeves up. He'd spent the last few days observing the cooks in the kitchen. The library, it turned out, did not have any books on something as common as cooking, and he felt ready to finally brave the simple task of making kanji. He'd even managed to something as common as cooking, and he felt ready to finally brave the simple task of making kanji. He'd even managed to acquire a small bundle of chilies thanks to a favor Nai Huaisong owed him. His homework wasn't going to finish itself on its own, after all. He started the same way he'd seen the cooks and servants in the kitchen work, by starting the fire under the stove. A stack of wood and a fire talisman should do it. One minor explosion later, he had a cheery fire going under the stove. All right, now he needed water. He looked around for a bucket. Ah, there. He quickly ran to the well, filling up his bucket. When he got back to the kitchen, he looked between the hempen bag of rice, the stove, and the bucket of water. The servants had washed the rice, but that was too much effort. It'd go into the water and get boiled anyway. Why bother washing it first? He dumped the water into the pot. Now, how much rice was he supposed to add? Oh, why were there no books about cooking in the library? He threw in a couple of handfuls. That still looked like so little, but the cooks hadn't filled the pots either. Maybe just another handful. He nodded to himself, closing the lid on the pot. What was he supposed to do now? The cooks had left the rice for a couple of shichen. Could he get the same effect if he added more wood to the fire? Worth a try, he thought. Satisfied that his rice was cooking, he turned his attention to the other ingredients needed for kanji. He hadn't been able to find chicken or any meat yet, but that was fine. He had his chilies, and there was some ginger and fresh scallions in a basket on the shelf. He didn't need anything else, did he? Wei Wuxian shrugged. It was probably fine. It was very much not fine. Somehow he had managed to both over and undercook the rice, and even with the chilies, the food tasted bland. Wei Wuxian gave the far too big pot of food a betrayed look. Wasn't kanji supposed to be a simple meal? How could he fail like this? The meal bell rang. Wei Wuxian sighed. Bland land food was better than this, at least. It was after a month of awkward classes, dodging the djinn who had a lot to say about his brand new rogue cultivator status, and fruitlessly trying to catch Lan Wangji, that Wei Wuxian finally remembered the learning agreement. Well, it wasn't so much that he remembered that as that Nai Huaisong decided to bother him about it on a random peaceful afternoon when Wei Wuxian was lazing around, leafing through a book on talismans that he borrowed from the library. There had to be a way to make a talisman that could heat up his bath water for him. Not that he couldn't take cold baths, but the well water from Gusu was significantly colder than the waters of Yunmeng. The agreement hadn't moved an inch from the haphazard pile of belongings he'd thrown it into that first night, which Nai Huaisong had decided to rifle through. Wei Wuxian frowned at that. Those were his things. He didn't remember giving Nai Huaisong permission to go through them. As if sensing his disapproval, Nai Huaisong lifted his hands, walking away from the corner in which his things had been catching dust for the past month. I'm just saying. Wei Wuxian handed Lan Kairin the signed agreement the next day and was promptly introduced to the arraymaster Lan Yuhua. She was an ageless-seeming older woman who was both outraged by his invention and absolutely fascinated by his thought process. Lan Kairin excused himself as soon as they started discussing the radicals he'd used. It seemed even the esteemed Lan Kairin had limits. Wei Wuxian had finally managed to catch Lan Wangji alone just a week after the agreement had been finished. After one too many inquiries into his brother's whereabouts, Lan Shichen, whom he had yet to thank for the tea that was mysteriously getting regularly restocked in his kitchen, had pressed an access token into his hands and pointed him down a path. That's how Wei Wuxian found himself getting an eyeful of Lan Wangji in the cold springs. Seriously, who the fuck willingly meditated in freezing water while naked? Well, mostly naked. Naked enough to not leave anything to the imagination in the middle of autumn. Wei Wuxian could feel the blush rising to his face as Lan Wangji turned around, a betrayed expression on his perfect face. Poking through his unbound hair were two small nubs. Antlers, Wei Wuxian thought distantly as he took in Lan Wangji rising out of the water. Nope, not doing that. They were supposed to talk. Wei Wuxian definitely wasn't supposed to ogle Lan Wangji. He'd rejected Lan Wangji. He shifted into a fox and threw himself straight into the cold water. He regretted that decision as soon as his body hit the water, yowling loudly as the cold cut through his fur like it didn't exist. Cold and drenched to the bone, he was left utterly defenseless when Lan Wangji lifted him out of the water, cradled him to his chest, dangerously close to his abs. His tails were brushing against Lan Wangji's far too thin and dripping wet undergarments, and oh gods, was that... Wei Wuxian would like to say his dip in the cold, icy waters had very effectively turned his thoughts away from Lan Zhan's jade-like perfection, but instead it had just made everything worse. Because Wei Wuxian was cradled close against Lan Zhan's jade-like perfection, and he was pretty sure those were not thoughts one should be having about their friend. In the end, they didn't talk at all. Lan Wangji shifted fully and curled up around a frankly pathetic-looking Wei Wuxian. With his usual fluff, dripping wet and hanging off of his thin fox body, not even the stone-faced second jade of Lan's heart could stay untouched. Wei Wuxian sighed and cuddled closer into the warmth of Lan Wangji. He hadn't had these cuddle sessions for long, but their absence in the past weeks had been noticeable. So here we actually have some art from Ruby that I have saved to my phone. So this is by Ruby, and it's super cute. Let me switch back to my camera so I can actually see. All right. Look how cute that is. They're snuggling. And I love the detail of the Lan ribbon being over there, and it's got the Genshin, the blue flowers. Genshin's, Genshin. His mama's flowers. If you know, you know. Here, like this, even with all they had to speak about, still unspoken, he felt safe. Perhaps they did not need to speak about it at all. Maybe they could just agree that mistakes had been made in a moment of high emotion or something. Yeah, that sounded like an idea. With that thought, Wei Wuxian allowed himself to fully relax, splaying his tails out to dry. The next day, Lan Wangji was back in class, greeting a beaming Wei Wuxian with a tiny, imperceptible nod when he slid into a seat just moments before Lan Kairin walked in. Wei Wuxian woke up on the day of his birthday with an itch under his skin. He went through the motions of getting dressed, brushing his hair into a haphazard ponytail, and tying his robes with fumbling fingers, anxious energy making him clumsy. Clumsier than usual. He could hear Yu Furen scolding in the back of his head. "Tie your robes properly!" Wei Wuxian wanted to tear the robes off. "Be grateful!" Right. He had robes. They were a gift. He shouldn't damage them. He finished tying his robes. By the time he was done, he was already far too late for breakfast. That was fine. He didn't think he could keep anything down. Wei Wuxian managed to arrive to class on time, filing in with the other students. He forced himself to sit still throughout the entire class. Somewhere, a tiny part of Wei Wuxian knew that he was acting odd, out of character. He knew that it had been noticed. A much larger part of Wei Wuxian was screaming at him to behave. Behave! Behave! Yu Furen had always punished him worse on his birthday. When class was over, Wei Wuxian walked straight back to his house. The house, not his. He couldn't get attached. It did not belong to him. If he didn't get attached, maybe it wouldn't hurt as bad when it was taken from him. He closed the door, throwing up 2 locking talismans for good measure. He methodically closed the 2 windows on either side of the house, giving them the same treatment as the door. He was too big now, when he shifted, to fit under the bed, but his instinct screamed for somewhere dark and narrow where he could hide without being seen. With no other option, he ended up pushing the bed closer to the wall, throwing the blanket and all his clothes into the gap. He jammed himself in the small space between the bed and the wall, burrowing under the pile of fabric. He knew rationally that he was still exposed. Anyone coming in would see the mess and grow suspicious. It didn't matter to his fox brain. A burrow meant safety. He was in his room. It was safe. Yu Furen would never come in here, and if he was in here, he couldn't be blamed for causing trouble elsewhere. He remembered turning 11 and learning to fear Zidian for daring to hope for a small cake like the other disciples celebrating their birthdays. He remembered turning 12 and being punished for having slightly crooked robes. He remembered turning 13, 14, and not even knowing what he was being punished for anymore. Wei Wuxian remembered being 15 and finally figuring out that if he made himself scarce and didn't show his face, he could not be dragged off for punishment. Wei Wuxian wasn't sure how long he'd been lying there when the knocking came. All he knew was that he was comfortable and safe, and that he wouldn't be moving an inch to open that door. Quite the opposite, he burrowed deeper into his pile. The knock repeated, this time followed by a soft, Wei Ying? Wei Wuxian knew that voice. That was Lan Wangji. Why was Lan Wangji here? Wei Wuxian shook his head. It didn't matter. He wasn't moving. If he didn't move, he couldn't do anything wrong. There was a soft sigh and then a clatter as something was placed down. I brought you food from Kaiyi. Nai Huaisong said you liked the spicy chicken. There was a pause and the sound of crinkling paper. There are preservation talismans on the food. I hope Wei Ying feels better soon. Wei Wuxian listened as Lan Wangji retreated. Why was he feeling sad about that? The steps paused, and then a whisper, something Wei Wuxian wasn't sure he was even meant to hear, yet hear it he did. Happy birthday, Wei Ying. And then he was gone, and Wei Wuxian was bolting out of his mockery of a burrow, only just stopping himself from ripping the door open and chasing after Lan Wangji. He shifted back into a human to open the door. As soon as he did, the enticing smell of the perfectly crispy, spicy fried chicken filled his nose. Lan Wangji had included a number of side dishes as well, from bright red pickled radish to a small serving of vegetable stir-fry. Wei Wuxian almost cried when his eyes fell on the plate of sweet cakes on the side, and he did cry when he opened the Qiankun pouch next to it and found some Emperor's Smile. He really... Wei Wuxian wanted to refuse the offering, and if Lan Wangji had been here, he very well may have. But the food was right there, and Lan Wangji had already left, and his words kept ringing through his head as the feeling in his chest swelled and swelled until Wei Wuxian thought it would burst out of him. Wei Ying deserves food, just like anyone else. Well, Wei Wuxian had food and a chest full of feelings he didn't know what to do with. So he pulled the large tray inside, careful not to spill anything, and slammed the door back shut. He stared at the tray. Stupid Lan Zan and stupid thoughtfulness. What right did he have to come into Wei Wuxian's life and act like Wei Wuxian was something precious that needed to be cared for? Wuxian was fine. He was. He didn't need somebody to be nice to him or get him cakes on his birthday. Wei Wuxian ignored the way his hand shook as he reached out for the plate of cakes, carefully lifting one out. The cake was still warm, and he cradled it in his hands. Some angry, furious part of him wanted to throw the whole thing across the room. Why now? Why not? What had he done that was so wrong? What had he done that he had been denied this simple thing for so long? He brought the cake up to his lips, biting into it. Something inside him loosened and broke as the sweet taste hit his tongue. He shoved the rest of the cake into his mouth as hot tears ran down his cheeks. He grabbed the second cake as soon as he swallowed the first, choking his sobs into the soft sweetness of it. He was making a mess, he knew, sprawled on the floor, getting crumbs everywhere. But he didn't care as he cried and absolutely demolished the plate of cakes. They were the best thing he'd eaten in his life. Wei Wuxian looked at the empty plate from where he was lying on his side, pressing his hot face into the cool wood. 6 cakes. Why had there been 6 cakes? What was Lan Zan trying to do? Wei Wuxian didn't know, and he wasn't sure it mattered. At some point, his tears ran dry, replaced by a feeling of emptiness. Not the kind of rotten, all-consuming emptiness he was used to, but the kind that promised something, like a tilled field after the rain. Slowly, ever so slowly, he picked himself off the floor, wiping his face with his sleeve. His robes were a lost cause anyway, and he quickly shrugged them off, dropping them to the floor as he stumbled into his small bathroom. The tub was glaringly empty, something he'd meant to work on but hadn't yet. Instead, he shoved his face into the small wash basin, the cold water feeling good against his overheated skin. He stayed that way until his lungs ached for breath, and he had no way but to comply with his body's demands. Gasping, water dripping down his face, he felt better than he had in weeks. The typical tint in the small bronze mirror did nothing to hide the redness of his eyes or the splotchiness of his cheeks that the cold water hadn't been able to get rid of. He grabbed a towel and rubbed vigorously at his face. There. Now it was still red, but better. He dropped the towel in his laundry basket, vaguely nudging the robes he'd dropped in the direction of it with his foot. They were a problem for later. Dressed in only his underrobes and feeling strangely refreshed, Wei Wuxian walked back into the main room. The tray still sat next to the door, food kept warm by the talismans Lan Wangji had applied. Wei Wuxian picked it up, setting it on the table. He pulled the Emperor's Smile out of the clutches of the Qiankun pouch, carefully putting the empty pouch aside to return it later. Lan Wangji had really gone all out. Wei Wuxian had to appreciate that much. His stomach growled as he took in the entirety of the tray again, reminding him that he hadn't eaten anything but those cakes today. He attacked the food with gusto, the spiciness a welcome change for the bland food and his own subpar attempts at cooking. The chicken was still perfectly crispy, and the vegetables offered a nice balance. The Emperor's Smile washed it all down perfectly. Who needed 3 bowls of rice or more when you could have this? Soon he cleaned all the plates and was left holding his mostly empty jar of alcohol. This was nice, but something told him it would have been nicer with company. Maybe next year. A part of him rejoiced at the idea that maybe he could have this again next year, while another screamed at him that the future was uncertain and he shouldn't be thinking about that. He firmly shut down that latter part. He was allowed to think about the future. There was no reason why he couldn't have this again next year. Just without the crying, maybe. Stuffed and wrung out, he allowed himself to shift, squirming his way back into his burrow. He'd clean up tomorrow. I'll have to thank Lan Zan, he vaguely thought, before his eyes drifted close. His birthday brought the issue of his bathtub back into sharp focus. The issue being that Wei Wuxian really was too lazy to haul and heat dozens of buckets of water from the well every time he wanted a bath. The answer to his problem was obvious. Talisman. Now, if only he could figure out the right combination of characters to put on them to get him the results he wanted. He felt like screaming as he crumpled yet another failed talisman, throwing it across the room. The pile of discarded talismans next to his laundry basket was slowly growing larger, and Wei Wuxian was not getting any closer to figuring it out. There had to be a way to do this. Every free second he had in the next few days was spent buried in books. Lan Hua had looked stunned by his idea before going off on a rant about how he should have asked her. She then proceeded to show him to the relevant corner of her library. Wei Wuxian was both elated and utterly baffled at the fact that he wasn't just allowed, but actively encouraged to pursue this project, and threw himself into it wholeheartedly. Part of the issue was that larger bodies of water, like, say, a tub, could not be heated with a simple fire talisman the way a teapot could. The amount of qi required to heat a bathtub made it impossible to control the temperature, and while boiling the water certainly was a way to implement the water purification Wei Wuxian wanted to add, so he'd only have to haul water once instead of whenever he wanted a bath, it was not helpful when one wanted a bath right now. The second part of the issue was that Wei Wuxian could not figure out which characters he needed to combine on the limited space of the talisman to make it work. His breakthrough came while talking to Lan Wangji. Although talking to may be the wrong way to describe the situation. Wei Wuxian had mostly been talking at Lan Wangji, who'd been playing some song or other on his guqin. It was when he'd noticed the song seemed to be missing something that the guqin couldn't give that inspiration had struck. His mistake was so stupid that he could only laugh. Of course it didn't work. He was trying to condense the whole thing into a talisman when an array was called for. There was no way he could fit everything he needed on a talisman. He'd tried, but he could create an array that could be activated with the correct talisman. Wei Wuxian did not notice when the guqin stopped, engrossed as he was with sketching out his array. If you put the fire radical on one side and left the spot for the talisman empty on the other side, if he did it right, the talisman could function as temperature control. Lan Wangji watched as, right before his eyes, Wei Wuxian revolutionized everything they knew about cleansing and heating in one single afternoon. Later, dripping water all over the porch of the Jingxi, Wei Wuxian would happily report that there had not even been a single explosion while testing the array, only a minor malfunction that had drenched both him and his entire bathroom. "But it works, Lanzan! Let me add it to your tub, you'll see!" And Wei Wuxian had done just that. After Lan Wangji had thrown a drying talisman at him. Wei Wuxian looked around the training yard. At this time of day, and with the fine dusting of snow on the ground, barely anyone was there, which suited him just fine. He hadn't practiced since that day, and the fewer people there that were there to watch him fumble his way through the book of forms he'd found in the library, the better. He wasn't allowed to use the Jiang style anymore now that he wasn't one, so when he'd stumbled on the book of clearly non-Lan sword forms in the library, he'd been all too happy to try them out. If he understood the book correctly, the script was old. The forms had belonged to a sect long forgotten. It was perfect for Wei Wuxian. He wasn't sure yet if the forms would work for him, but there was something thrilling about learning forgotten knowledge and maybe making something new with it. Nobody could accuse him of plagiarism if he learned a forgotten style, then changed it to fit his own sword and strengths. He picked a quiet corner, hidden behind a few trees, and got to work. The basic stances were simple enough, if unfamiliar. It was when he started moving between them that he realized why this may have been shelved and forgotten. Wei Wuxian considered himself a person with good balance and an affinity for speed, but going through the movement Following them exactly as the manual described and showed, Wei Wuxian noticed that not only was he constantly about to trip over, he was also utterly unable to build the momentum required for the flow. No matter how hard he tried, he could not help but feel as if he were about to fall over. It was like the forms had been made for someone with a different center of gravity. How was Wei Wuxian supposed to change his center of gravity? That's not something practice was going to fix for him. Out of the corner of his eyes, he caught sight of a small dragon throwing themselves at their opponent, landing on their head with perfect balance, flicking their tail right in their face. Of course! Cultivators were so much more! What if he... The shift washed through him easily, tail splayed behind him, and Wei Wuxian really needed to examine how that worked one day because he was definitely wearing trousers and robes. He moved into the first stance again, already feeling more stable, more grounded. The movement, when he tried again, came smoothly, easily. When he reached the end of the first sequence, he started again, this time allowing himself to build up speed. And again. Caught in the momentum of his own movements, he laughed. His form was perfect for him. It was like it had been made for him. Wei Wuxian decided not to dwell on that, or the implications of a forgotten sect with a sword style made for foxes. He was too busy being happy, and there was no point dwelling on it. He eventually let himself slide to a stop. Off to the side, a small figure in white clapped before rushing to him. Wei Wuxian, please teach me, Li Jing shouted. Li Shimei. Wei Wuxian was unable to control the surprise in his voice. Aren't you supposed to be in class right now? He asked. Li Jing pouted. I don't like it there. Wei Wuxian felt a shiver running down his spine. Surely not, right? Why not? Is someone being mean or unfair to you? He asked, carefully watching her reaction. She pouted even more. They put me with the babies. They said I couldn't have a sword until I learned the basic Lan forms, and it's so unfair. Tears welled up in her eyes. I know all the Jiang ones. I was supposed to have a sword and be practicing with Gigi, and... The tears started running down her face, and Wei Wuxian started to panic. He wasn't good with crying people. No, I can't even see her, she hiccuped, and the tears dripped in earnest. Wei Wuxian pulled her into a hug. That's what you're supposed to do, right? One of his hands came up to cradle the back of her head, and his tails curled around her protectively. He was glad she wasn't being mistreated, but that he could have helped with. This he didn't know. It was unfair that she wasn't allowed a sword. She had more than earned hers, and her family certainly would have had one ready for her. Instead, she was stuck having to relearn all the basics. Considering his own predicament, Wei Wuxian could relate. But perhaps she didn't need to struggle on her own. Wei Wuxian couldn't teach her what he was learning, but he'd seen enough of the Lan forms to help her with them. Maybe he could enlist Lan Wangji to help too. He tried to picture the other teen teaching Li Jing and had to hold back a snort. He couldn't imagine Lan Wangji interacting with children, no matter how patient he clearly was. He put up with Wei Wuxian, after all. When Li Jing's shoulders stopped shaking and her breathing calmed down, Wei Wuxian gently peeled her off of him. He explained his plan to her, and while she was clearly unhappy that she wouldn't be learning his forms, she seemed excited at the prospect of maybe learning from one of the best swordsmen in the Lan Sect. He would have sent her off and back to class, unwilling to be the reason she missed even more, but she loudly demanded fox cuddles, and who was he to deny her big, sad kitten eyes? As the winter progressed, the snow started to come in thicker. No longer the fine dusting Wei Wuxian had seen in the training yard that day, but thick, fluffy layers upon layers of snow. It was, in a word, delightful. Wei Wuxian was having the time of his life, jumping around the garden, his garden, as a fox, leaving holes and paw prints in the immaculate snow. Nai Huaisong, on the other hand, was very much not delighted. Red pandas, Wei Wuxian was finding out, were ill-suited for the cold. which was a real shame for Nai Huaisong because Wei Wuxian was not letting him slip out when some of the disciples started a snowball fight on the training fields. Everyone was throwing snow at everyone, and it was the most fun Wei Wuxian remembered ever having with fellow disciples. They weren't even punished for it because the Lan disciples that had started it framed it as a useful training exercise against flying objects. Wei Wuxian loved snow. Over the course of the winter, Wei Wuxian had fallen into a steady routine with Li Jing, meeting her twice a week to help her with her sword forms and any other studying she was struggling on. So when he reached the training field one early spring day and she was not there, he couldn't help but worry. Li Jing had always made sure to be on time for these lessons, often already training before Wei Wuxian made his way down, so her absence was noticeable to say the least. He briefly wondered if he'd gotten the days wrong. It happened sometimes when he spent too much time on a project, but Lan Yuehua had been the one to shoo him out of her library this time, and she definitely knew the days. So Li Jing was late. Before he could worry overly much, the sound of a voice drifted over from the path. One of them sounded like Li Jing, which was good because she wasn't allowed to make him worry like that. Worry? Wei Wuxian isn't going to mind. He's been helping me a lot, and he's really good, you know. You'll be doing better in no time. Oh? Wei Wuxian thought to himself. Had Ishime made a new friend? Li Jing burst through the trees with two other children in tow. They looked a little younger than her, but barely. Classmates? Wei Wuxian, you're early, Li Jing cried. Me? Early? How dare you accuse me of such heinous crimes, Wei Wuxian replied dramatically. Here I was, worrying about you. He clutched at his chest. Your poor Wei Wuxian finally came right on time, and you weren't there. He smiled when Li Jing burst into laughter. So, I see you brought friends, he teased, dropping the act, genuinely curious about why she brought them. He could take a guess, considering what he'd overheard. Li Jing glared at him, cheeks flushed. At least I have friends, she snapped. She slapped her hands over her mouth when she realized what she'd just said. Sorry? Wei Wuxian laughed. She was too much fun to tease, and at least he could get a reaction out of her, unlike a certain second jade of Lan. I deserve that, he admitted, turning to the other two children, a boy and a girl. You're joining the lesson, right? They looked at each other before looking back at him, nodding vigorously. Yes, please. Li Jing sidled up to him. They're turning 10 soon, but they can't get the last few basic forms down, and Zhang Shixian said they wouldn't be allowed swords until they could do them with their eyes closed. Wei Wuxian nodded, clasping his hands together. Do you have your training swords with you? The three children all gave an affirmative, already getting in line in front of him. Then let's get started. No child of mine is going to celebrate their 10th birthday without a sword. Wei Xiong! Nai Huaisong wailed, throwing his arms around Wei Wuxian. You have to promise to write a letter a day. I will be so bored without you. Wei Wuxian pat Nai Huaisong's head, already over the dramatics. He wasn't dying, so what's up with the waterworks? Off to the side, Meng Yao was apologizing profusely for his young master's behavior, but Wei Wuxian waved him off. That was just how Nai Huaisong was. Eventually, Nai Huaisong peeled himself off of Wei Wuxian, making a show of sniffing loudly. If I don't hear from you, I'll come check on you myself, he declared. Wei Wuxian shook his head. You're just trying to get out of saber training, aren't you? Of course, Nai Huaisong replied cheerfully, winking at him. But I have missed my collections dearly, so it's time for me to leave. He did just that, walking right out of the gate of the cloud recesses. Do keep me updated on how things go with your Lan Guga. Wei Wuxian was going to drown him. Before he could jump him to do just that, though, Nai Huaisong turned around again. Oh, I almost forgot. He pulled out a small bundle from his sleeve. I thought I'd do you a small favor, he said as he shoved the bundle into Wei Wuxian's arms. He turned around and took off. Remember to write! Wei Wuxian stared at his friend, rapidly disappearing back before dropping his gaze to the bundle in his arms. What the hell? He carried it back to his room, utterly puzzled. Surely Nai Huaisong wouldn't have given him porn right there in front of the guards, right? He blushed and lengthened his stride. At his house, he locked the door, adding a privacy talisman for good measure. One could never be too sure when something involved Nai Huaisong. He sat down at his desk, carefully setting down the bundle in front of him. Before he could overthink it, he pulled the wrapping open. 2 official-looking purple letters and a Qiankun pouch came spilling out. Wei Wuxian jerked away from the table as soon as the color registered. What the fuck? Why did Nai Huaisong have official letters from Yunmeng Jiang? One's bearing his name at that. He carefully prodded at them. When nothing blew up or bit him, he carefully opened the first one. The formality of it made his skin itch. Instead of accusations or demands for his return or any variation of it that Wei Wuxian had expected, the letter simply confirmed the arrival of his formal resignation letter. What formal resignation letter? Wei Wuxian wanted to ask, and confirmed that he was no longer a Jiang disciple. It had been signed by Jiang Fengmian and Yu Furen. The second letter confirmed the return of his Jiang robes, so that was what Nai Huaisong had been looking for in his things that day, and the return of his own possessions as well as all remaining unpaid compensation. Wei Wuxian blinked at that. Unpaid compensation? He wasn't due any compensation, nor did he have any remaining personal effects with the Jiangs. He opened the pouch, and dozens upon dozens of papers fell out, followed by a variety of small bits and bobs. He sat there, surrounded by the contents of his own chambers, entirely stunned. He hadn't realized that there had been quite that much trash in his room. There was, of course, not a single yuan included. Wei Wuxian could live with that. He found that he didn't want any of the Jiang's money anyway. What he did want was to strangle Nai Huaisong for not telling him there was a formal procedure to follow and simply doing it in his stead. It had been months! There was no excuse! Since Nai Huaisong had very smartly, Wei Wuxian had to admit, run off before Wei Wuxian could enact any of his murder plans, Wei Wuxian pulled out a sheet of paper and got to work. Nai Huaisong wanted him to write. Write he would! So that's actually the end of chapter 2. And here are the author's notes. So comments feed me, so please do feel free to continue straight down to the comments section. The last chapter and the epilogue will be posted on Saturday morning, same time too. Please look forward to it. So we're actually going to end there for today. The second part, so part 2, will come out tomorrow, same time. But yeah, feel free to go give some love to DamieMontclair. They're pretty cool. They got some good stuff. And I will see you for the second part tomorrow. Bye-bye.